Welcome. Thanks for joining us. World News presents Dr. Christoper Reed and the Chicago Black History Forum. This narration comes from the History Makers, www.thehistorymakers.com. Historical scholar Christoper Robert Reed was born on January 11, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, to Robert and Josephine Reed. Reed's maternal great-grandfather served in the 116th Infantry of the United States Colored Troops during the Civil War and took part in the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. Growing up in East Garfield Park on Chicago's west side, Reed attended John Marshall Elementary School and graduated from John Marshall High School in 1959. Starting at Crane Junior College, Reed earned his BA and MA degrees in history from Roosevelt University in 1963 and 1968, respectively. While attending Roosevelt University, he met future colleagues John Bracey, professor of history at University of Massachusetts, and Juliet K. Walker, founder of the Center for Black Business History. The Roosevelt faculty included Charles V. Hamilton, Augustus Mayer, St. Clair Drake, and Lorenzo Dow Turner. At Roosevelt, Reed was also a member of the Negro History Club. From 1971 to 1980, he served as assistant professor of history at Northern Illinois University, and from 1980 to 1982, he served as Dean of Arts and Sciences at Malcolm X College, formerly Crane Community College. In 1982, Reed garnered his PhD from Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. From 1982 to 1987, Reed served as professor of Black Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He returned to Roosevelt University as professor of history in 1987, where he taught courses on North American slavery, the history of blacks in Chicago, 1770 to 1960, and the history of blacks in Chicago, 1960 to the present. Dr. Reed is the author of several books, including The Chicago NAACP and the Rise of Black Professional Leadership, 1910 to 1966. In 1967, All the World is Here, The Black Presence at White City, a book about African and African American participation in Chicago's Columbian Exposition of 1893. In 2000, wrote the introduction for History of the Chicago Urban League with Arvah E. Strickland in 2001, and Black Chicago's First Century, Volume 1, 1833 to 1900, in 2005. He retired from teaching in 2009. Dr. Reed is often called upon as an expert on Chicago history and the history of Black Chicago. He is a member of the East Garfield Park Coalition, the West of Western Housing Alliance, the Martin Luther King Jr. Boys and Girls Club, and was a member of the West Side Coalition for Unity and Political Action, supporting the late Harold Washington. In 2001 at Roosevelt, he was the recipient of the St. Clair Drake Award for Outstanding Scholarship. Dr. Reed's Chicago Black History Forum keeps his grandfather's Army discharge papers in a bank vault. Dr. Reed is married and lives in the Chicago area.
Here today, I don't know, Dr. Darlene Clark-Hand of Northwestern University, and our Vice President, Professor Robert Starks, may be in also. Our treasurer has been gone from Chicago for a month. He's on a 4-month round-the-world trip. That's Robert Howard. So that puts you in good company when you come to foreign meetings. He and his wife should be somewhere in Southeast Asia now, but they won't be. It's a 4-month round the world trip. And the mission of this organization is put here. We're strictly about history. We're strictly about us. What did we do? Who are we? Where did we think we're going? And what we found out that the answers to the question are, hey, we are quite a group. I know I'm always proud to say, thank you, Lord, for making me a colored man. I'm old. Let's just get started. I have 5 sets of questions here. And this, as I said, this is more enjoyable really as a discussion. Let's start out with the man who was the first permanent non-Indian settler in this area, DuSable. And I noticed that I forgot to put his name in. Isn't that something? So would you correct that? Jean-Baptiste Point DuSable. I have it backwards. I mean, would just go to show, you know, don't show off. If you, yeah, DuSable. Anybody have any questions about DuSable? Go ahead, brother Jeff.
So much about him, about this one here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, what's
Who
that?
was the student?
Well, the student was a black man from, well, he went back to Alabama. Let me guess, he's from Alabama. Nathan Monroe Work. He used to publish the annual Negro yearbook. He came to Chicago to study at the University of Chicago at the end of the century, the 1890s. And he wrote a master's thesis on blacks and their property holding in the city. Yeah, so that's what that's from the Tribune.
Yeah.
That's actually from the Tribune, that blue sheet. And so the white people recognized that the first permanent settler in Chicago was DuSable, a Negro, a black man. So there's no question. You don't have to argue with anybody. That's why I brought these to pass out. There's no argument. Everybody knows who the first permanent settler was, DuSable, or DuSable. And they say, oh, he was a man of myth, a man of legend. No, it's a fact. All the books, the documents are lined up. There's no doubt who he was and what he did. Now, one of the things about, notice I started you out by saying, how did he live? Was his housing a cabin? And obviously the way this is set up, the answer is what? No. No, he didn't live in a cabin in the 1790s. Although people out west usually lived in cabins. He was a prosperous trader. He was born down in Haiti. His father was probably French. His mother was of West African origin. And like a lot of people from Haiti and in the French persuasion, he made his way through French America, which was up the Mississippi. Mobile, Alabama was a French settlement. Got some people from Mobile. Let's see your hands. This sounds like a plan. Anybody from New Orleans? New Orleans, okay. Up to New Orleans, all the way up Natchez, up to St. Louis, right? And then you go up from St. Louis before you hit the Illinois River, come all the way up, move across land a little bit, up the Illinois to hit the Des Plaines, and you end up in the Chicago River, and then you're at the end of your journey where the river, as the natives said, where the river meets the lake. And that's where DuSable set up his trading post. Now, the records show that he had a very established settlement all his own. The key record is a deed when he left in 1800. The record is over in Detroit. It's an official record in Detroit because Detroit was the county seat of what was then Wayne County. This was part of Wayne County. Now Wayne County is in Michigan.
So he was a free person, right?
He was free. He was free, yeah. And very wealthy. And so when he left, the deed showed he had a lot of holdings. And even, as I say here, he even had paintings which were put on the wall.
Did he have children?
He had 2. And then she wants, this is one of our regular members, she wants to know, what does his wife look like? Looks something like you, except she was a native Potawatomi woman. In fact, you sort of resemble his wife. You look at Indian woman to me. He wasn't gonna choose just anybody.
That's right.
He chose somebody who you look like. And you look like them, they look like you. Kitty Waha.
Kitty Warhawk.
Yeah, and then they called her Catherine. Dusaba was a Catholic. They were married first in the native tradition, then they were married before a priest. She took the name Catherine. They had 2 children that were baptized. Now what amazed me was we used to argue about what did he do. There's no argument. Then in 1985, Leo Burnett Advertising placed an ad on WFMT. Anybody listen to the good 98.7, good listening, classical music? Yeah. That ad in 1985 said he had a dream. He looked out across the lake and he wanted to build an economic powerhouse here. And he did it. That man's name was Jean-Baptiste Point Dusab. And just like Dusab, who had a vision of Chicago being a commercial center, United Airlines also has a vision. It was a United Airlines ad. So I called them, I said, can I have a copy of that? And they sent me one, but it was never to be printed. It was just to be read on the air in 1985. I said, boy, this is a big deal. United Airlines and Leo Burnett Advertising were talking about Dusab and his vision for this city. He knew what it was going to become. So here you can see, he lived not in a cabin, but in a homestead. He had a building for baking, a building for his animals, a building for his tools, a bakehouse. So he sold bread. This man was more successful than Willie Wilson, who has $1 million. More successful than, who's the fella that sold BET?
Johnson.
Bob Johnson, yeah. Number of black success, more successful than, what's her name? Radio 1, black woman.
Cassie Hughes.
Yeah, it's a lot of black folks with a lot of money, and they just didn't start getting money. Some crazy black people even had some slaves in the 1800s down in Louisiana. It was for the money. And so he said, well, because what did I learn from a session like this? There are friends you can have. These are my friends from way back when. But then there are people you better be suspicious of. And the people that held slaves out of Louisiana in the 1800s for money was somebody I definitely wouldn't trust. They were in it for the money. And other black people in records that held slaves, say over in Virginia, they'd hold slaves because that was his mother, his father, his wife, his sister, his brother, his children. That's the only way they could be protected, by being called slaves in the slaveholding state. But those folks in Louisiana were out for the money. Don't trust them. Anybody here from Louisiana, other than the people of New Orleans?
Yeah, my family was from Virginia, Louisiana.
Well, those are honest folks. Those were slaves. Those were slaves, yeah. That were held back.
Don't even try.
No, those were honest folks. Yeah. But basically, the question of slaveholding, we don't want to get into that, but I always raise this question. We don't know whether or not Dusaba was anti-slaveholding or pro-slaveholding. We don't know. Because the French promoted slavery in French America, up and down the Mississippi. But there were no slaves when he was here in Chicago, and he traded one-on-one with the native people, basically the Potawatomi people. Mr. Callaway, is this being sound recording or just visual?
Sound.
Okay, I better be careful what I say. I got a lot more I'm going to hold back on. But we don't know. Let's just assume he wasn't for slavery. But we don't know. Because he was out making a lot of money. Now, this home that he had, was people over on the East Coast built their homes as log cabins to begin with. Then we also know everybody on the East Coast didn't build They're housing the same way. The people that were Puritans didn't build log cabins. In fact, the log cabin is something really related to living in a place like Scandinavia. DuSable didn't live in a cabin. At the time of the World's Fair of 1933 here in Chicago, the black Chicagoans pressured the people putting on the World's Fair. That was the second World's Fair. We got to have a DuSable homestead. We got to have something showing DuSable. So they finally relented, the people running the fair. Space was provided, and a cabin was built with taxpayers' money, because the black folks didn't have any money. If you had money, you could have done like the Catholic Association did, built a better home, showing where Father Marquette had lived. You have to have money to get things done. So I asked the lady who was the hostess in the cabin back in 1933, I asked her about 30 years ago, why did you African Americans choose to display DuSable's homestead as a cabin? She said, we didn't have any money, that's the best we could do. And they borrowed from other settlements around the country to get tools to put in that cabin. DuSable did not live in a plain cabin, that's the point. DuSable was prosperous. DuSable was a man with a vision. DuSable was recognized in the 20th century, starting with the blue sheet by the Tribune as the city's original settler. This is factual. As of 4 or 5 years ago, the city council voted to recognize March 4th of every year, which is the city's birthday, as Jean-Baptiste Point DuSable Day. Last year was a day that was shared with the Polish people. They moved in on March 4th. The city council voted this out 4 or 5 years ago, DuSable Day. But since folks don't keep up with anything, them in their ear while they're willing to listen, then they don't know about it. And they'll get up at meetings and say, why can't we have a DuSable of every year? You have a DuSable Park that was supposed to be built down by Navy Pier. The problem holding that up was it would take $12 million to just get the land together to support the park. It was cleaned of all its chemicals years ago when Harold Washington was mayor, but there's still about $12 million worth of work needed around to shore up, you know, the actual earth in front of the park, in front of the lake. And that there was a deal underfoot with an Irish developer who was going to build a building called the Spire. But the design was by Santiago Calatrava. And the recession hit. So there will be no Spire. And the people building the Spire agreed, in front of the Spire, we will help finance this park. It'll be good to walk out, look at the lake as you're standing in DuSable Park. They had no problems with this man of African descent being recognized at the park. They put the money up. There's a DuSable Harbor, DuSable High School, a small DuSable Park.
No street.
Yeah, that's right. Somebody has said, why don't you name Lakeshore Drive?
No Balboa.
Well, you'd run into trouble with Balboa. It's a short little street, but you'd run into trouble with who? What group?
Italians.
Yeah, the Italians were proud that during the Second World's Fair of 1933, an Italian general led a fleet of seaplanes all the way from Italy across the Atlantic, and they landed in Lake Michigan.
They were fascists.
Well, that's questionable. They say Balboa was not a fascist.
Yeah, I heard that too, that he was a fascist. He
Yeah,
killed a lot of people.
Yeah, it was raised by Vernon Jarrett in the Sun Times, and then the Italian community said, even though the leadership of Italy was under the fascist leadership of Benito Mussolini, General Balboa, Italo Balbo, was not a fascist. But the point is, that's their street. They're not giving that up. Plus, it's a short street. Some have said you need a street the length of Lakeshore Drive. Nothing has been done. But that doesn't stop people from what? Naming it themselves. The late, great Dr. Margaret Burroughs in 1984 said, I'm going to start addressing all my letters as so-and-so, so-and-so, what did she call it? DuSableVille, Illinois. You can take unto yourself the power to make things happen. I know down at Roosevelt University, all the professors were born on certain days. You had an assignment. They didn't say, can we have this day off for religious purposes? You just didn't meet. You can take unto yourself. I learned this from a family down the street. You can ask for things. You can demand things. For example, respect. But you should be what? Commanding respect and commanding control over things. Then you're in good shape. You command things. Instead of, please, Mr. Slave Master, can I have this or that? You command it. Back in the back, Brother King, take hundreds of young men out on the work site, and you what? You command respect because they're out there ready to work. They look like they can work. They got muscles. They're not old men, they're young men. You command the attention of everybody out there, and you get something. Anybody know why DuSable might have decided to leave in 1800? Because he was doing well. What was happening in this country's history in 1800 that would have convinced him to leave? Well, this is sort of tricky. You have to really know deep American history. You have to know, for example, that there was a big battle over around Toledo, Ohio in 1794. Thousands of native warriors fought thousands of Battle of Fallen Timbers. And the Americans won. The year before, the Native Americans had won, 1793. Worst defeat the U.S. Army had ever suffered. The next year they came back and beat the Native Americans. The Native Americans, a year after that, 1795, signed the treaty giving away land where we are right now. The Treaty of Greenville, yeah, in 1795. Now it took 8 years for the Americans to finally send soldiers out to formally lay claim to the land. But it made sense for a man like DuSable to leave before the Americans arrived in 1803, 1804 to build their fort and raise the American flag. Because as you know, you should know, the U.S. Constitution recognized you as what? Nothing, but then 3/5 of a person. Well, you are nothing really, but you were 3/5 of a person for purposes of what? Taxation and representation, but they didn't recognize you as a person. You were just recognized as 3/5 of a person for those two, elements of governance, taxation and representation. You were nobody and nothing. By the way, last week I was over at DuSable and we were talking about the 13th Amendment, and I started thinking back, that's right. We got the impression during the 1960s that maybe the Declaration of Independence included us, all men are created equal. You look highly intelligent. You must attend Chicago State University. Is that true? I've seen her before today. Is that true? She got that look. Is that true?
Yes.
All right. It's the look they have. And by the way, I took 2 of my courses as undergrad at Old Chicago Teachers College South. I took 2 courses there. Yeah. I'm proud to say it.
Very proud.
Anybody here from Roosevelt? Okay.
1965,
right.
graduate.
78.
All right, 1963. How about you, young man in the back?
89.
Roosevelt? You look familiar.
Yes, sir.
I knew it was something about that boy. This guy's solid. Okay. Any questions about DuSable? Nothing to be questioned. No debate. It's a waste of time. It's documented who he was, what he did.
So you
And
think he left because of that
the
battle?
Americans would be coming. Because of the Treaty of 1795, they were going to be coming. Some other people have guessed, some of the friends of Margaret Burroughs, that it could have been disappointment with not being made a sub-chieftain of the Potawatomi. The Potawatomi people control this area. If you want to see how they live, you can go over to the Field Museum, they show you. They didn't live in teepees, they lived in lodges. And they moved from town to town. They grow crops here, and then they were pretty smart when the weather was like this, they weren't going to be living here. You go somewhere else. Who's going to stay where the weather's inclement like this? So but this was their territory, the Ojibwa. And I learned how to, they're also Chippewa. I learned their real name from a woman at Roosevelt who was one of them. She said, oh, our real name is not Chippewa Indians or Ojibwa. Our real name is Anishinaabe. I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, what is your name in the original language? She said, you know, it would take me a month talking to somebody from the group to learn how to pronounce my name. What happened with the Anishinaabe was the whites came in, drove them out, and even when they were living far, far away from whites, like up in the Dakotas, they come at night. She said, my sister was snatched at 3 in the morning, about 50 years ago, and taken to a school and turned into what? An honorary white person. That's what they did in Australia with the Aborigines. They did it here. They snatched the Native American children. Anyway, the thought is he was disappointed by not being made a member of the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi leadership. He could have been like the emissary to the foreigners or something. He wasn't going to be the major chief. But that's a theory, Brother Tony Burrows.
I think the other question is when DuSable relocated to St. Charles, what did he do in St. Charles? We know that area was much more developed than Chicago was, so there might be more incentive for him to go there rather than leave Chicago.
It could be. You know what I said earlier, though? You know what I said, though? And that was near St. Louis, of course, St. Charles.
Right.
But here, he was so well established, according, if you looked at the deed of what he had, he did everything. You know, bake bread, sell this and that, and then that ignorant alderman from the 14th Ward, Ed Burke, had the nerve to say he what? He probably sold whiskey to the Indians. That's nonsense. See, that's how you tear somebody down. That's what you call hating. Why not tear him down? He had no evidence of that. That's nonsense. But then he wanted to tear down DuSable. At the time, people were talking about naming a street for DuSable.
And stereotyping the Indians as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Why wouldn't they name Fort Dearborn after DuSable, since that's so...
No. Don't you get it, brother? Who was coming in?
Racist Americans.
And who left?
Gotcha.
Anybody like the man in the Black House in Washington? Well, a whole lot of folk don't like him. And it's as simple as this. It's as simple as that. I know I would be nervous staying in an area where a group of people were going to take over control, a group of people who had slavery legitimized in the law of the land, the U.S. Constitution. They were committed to that. And even though the Northwest Territory said there wasn't going to be any slavery, there was still slavery here because it had been there from French days. And this area didn't become a state till 1800, and they only kept slavery out by one vote. But DuSable got out in 1800, which was probably smart, to an area under French control down on the Mississippi, north of St. Louis. Different attitude towards people of color. But the Americans were not about to respect somebody with his wealth and influence over this area. They got rid of the Native Americans, didn't they? By the 1830s, all were bid farewell as they were pushed across the Mississippi River. They were all out of Chicago by the 1830s. So that's what I imagine. It's got to be awareness of an unfriendly, uncomfortable environment being created once the Americans arrived. They got here 8 years after the signing of the treaty. He would have known about them and their attitudes to people that didn't look like they did.
Were these Americans specifically British?
No, these were Americans. Remember the Americans won the revolution by 1783, And they were trying to control the area west of the mountain. Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. There was a British influence. The French influence was being lessened. But their agreement with the British at the end of the Revolutionary War was they had control of the Northwest Territory. So it was just a matter of time before they could get enough settlers to come here and actually dominate the landscape. Now, let me, off the subject, I had an interesting experience. I was going through Fremont, Ohio, down the turnpike, whatever they call it, turnpike or tollway. I got off, I went to the Presidential Library of President Rutherford B. Hayes. And it's interesting, he was a very wealthy man, had a great big home that had been turned into a library and presidential research center. And I started looking at how the whites settled the area. And they kept talking about fighting. They were fighting every week against the native people in Ohio, because they weren't going to give up their land without a fight. They did the same thing in Indiana. Constant fighting through the 1830s. Weren't going to give up their land. I said, oh, I see, this is interesting. And it's not emphasized enough in school. These people didn't get up. See, our image is what the Indians just fought poorly and disappeared. No, they fought bravely, they did lose, and then all were pushed westward to reservations, i.e. specialized plantations, where they still today. Poor American Negro was smart enough to get along, and now is in the Black House in Washington. That's why it doesn't make sense to knock us. Maybe our plan was the best. We are really dominant, Brother Thomas.
I'm sorry, it came to late.
No, go ahead, by the way, he's going to be speaking later on murals around Chicago later on this spring. Go ahead, Guy Thomas.
Wasn't there some discussion about him being, DuSable being arrested by the British? I don't know if you covered
Yeah, he was, well, we didn't talk about that. He was, because he was in the French influence when the British and the French were fighting.
Yeah, and it describes how he looked.
Yeah, how did he look, by the way?
Well,
somebody said this about you. Well-educated, handsome Negro. That's what a woman said about you over at Daly College. I didn't want to tell you. But that's actually in writing, that DuSable was called an educated, handsome Negro. Yeah, a handsome Negro, educated. He wasn't, chumperoony or something. Yeah. That's what the British wrote it up. They weren't his friends, but that's what he was. A prosperous guy, very friendly with the French, very friendly with obviously he was friendly with the French. He came from Haiti. He was quite a guy. And I'm glad we have had enough sense to recognize him. And by the way, I was looking to see how much of his story would have been told to folks once Chicago was being settled in the 1830s. And so somebody said, well, DuSable had been gone, I bet nobody talked about it. And I said, well, look, if you're in the frontier area, in this area around here, 30 years after he left, actually had a bear come down to the middle of downtown. 300-pound bear was down at LaSalle and Monroe. This was documented. There were wolves around. They just reintroduced bison, which you call buffalo, back into the state. You had coyotes, you had everything running around. This was a frontier area. You're sitting around at night with nothing to do, you will talk, right, as a form of entertainment. Your recreational effort will revolve around stories, and you can't tell me people are not going to say, oh, that place over there where, what's the guy's name that took DuSable's place? Kinsey. Yeah, there was a black man who was over there one time, very prosperous. Because people talk. You have nothing else to do. There's no television, no radio, no social media. You talk. So the story's got to come up about this black man. Larger than life, successful, prosperous. Recognized for you who came in late in 1985 on FM radio as part of a Leo Burnett ad for United Airlines. Recognized settler. No dispute. Let's move on though. So we know people throughout the years have been talking about DuSable. No question. By the way, there's the DuSable walkway too, along the river, between Michigan all the way out to the lake.
Did he sell his property, or he just walked away from it?
No, he had, the deed was for everything that was on the land. He sold everything he had.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's at Wayne County seat, Detroit now. Wayne County, Michigan. Let's move to the frontier period. There's this gap. The Americans come 1803, 1804. Their fort is built. The next we hear of black people, there might have been a black slave there tending to the needs of one of the officers' wives, maybe a black man a little later. But it's in the 1830s that you have a greater number of whites coming into the area to live. So by 18, frontier period, you have the state government recognizing Chicago as a town, and then 4 years later, on March 4th, 1837, Chicago is chartered as a city. And by the way, the interesting thing about a discussion like this is, you start thinking, oh, I really didn't care about the importance of power resting down in the State House until we discussed this. A state government has to what? Recognize your right to exist as a city. Every time Chicago wants major legislation passed, the city council has to go where? Springfield, get permission. Enabling legislation. So in 1837, the charter was issued. Chicago had enough people, had a little government, was considered a city. Blacks started to filter in. As my father, my dear father, used to say, Negro here, Negro there, Negro everywhere. You cannot keep blacks from doing anything and from any place. We are assertive, we are dynamic, we are winners, we are champions.
We are everywhere.
We are everywhere. Everywhere you go, you see a black person, and they're doing well as much as doing poorly. We have people do, by the way, I meant to read, but I haven't read the Count of Monte Cristo, because I wanted to read something written by a black man. I wanted to read The Man in the Iron Mask. I haven't read it yet. How about you? Written by a black man.
Three Musketeers is written by Alexander Dumas.
That's the man who wrote The Man in the Iron Mask. I wanted to read some poetry in Russian, but I haven't got around to it. Pushkin, a black man. Negro here, Negro there, Negro everywhere. Shakespeare wanted to write a play, and he wanted a man who was great with ego and power. So he took all the stories he had heard about military leaders in the Mediterranean, and he put them all together in this black man, this Moor, called who?
Othello.
Yeah. There really wasn't an Othello, but there were real men who were military commanders over white forces spread throughout the Mediterranean. And so he made this man the subject of the play. The man had great power, but he also had what? Weakness. Obsession with his wife. Nothing wrong with that. Somebody looked at Jay-Z's wife a little bit too close about a week ago. Guy hadn't been seen since. You know what's funny? Miss Josella, we know you're
Please don't
educated.
bring me into this.
No, who is Jay-Z's wife for those that don't know?
Beyonce.
Okay, because everybody here doesn't know. See, some of these folks,
Oh, come on.
no, look, I'm going to tell you about them. They don't know that. They don't know that. They don't keep up. They don't keep up. Yeah. So anyway, Othello was the subject, but it was real that there were these military. I'm thinking about one real life military commander, though, going back 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years before Othello. Starts with an H and ends with an L.
Hannibal.
Hannibal, yeah.
You got historians in here. Why are you giving us the easy stuff?
Everybody, she's taking notes. You ever heard of Hannibal? Honestly. And we're not out to embarrass him. But the point is,
right.
there's a lot of things, like my sister told me there was a black banker on 31st or 35th. Couldn't be. I never heard of a black banker. This is 40-some years. Who ever heard of a black banker in Chicago? Way back 100 years ago. The man's bank was on the corner down here, Jesse Bingham's bank. Then he moved down to 35th and State in the bank building. Then he had the nerve to build from the ground up on the corner where the IIT administrative building, one of the buildings is. Northwest corner, Jesse Bingham, the banker. Then there's across the street, right now there's a bank building still standing. When you leave here, right down here, 36th Street, the Douglas National Bank building. A black man owned that.
Really?
Yeah. This is why these meetings are so important. Because we've done so much. Over there, you got black firemen, 1872. Black policemen in Chicago, 1872, right after the fire.
What about Supreme Life?
1919. That's when they got fired. First legal reserve north of the Mason-Dixon line. I mean, we've done so much. I didn't know there were black Civil War soldiers from Chicago and Illinois. I heard a man say something about that, and now I ended up doing a book. And I'm not here to sell books, this is the only one I've got, but I got the man's photograph here. And of all things, the man's name, his first name was A-D-E. How do you pronounce that? Ade. You know what group, what would you identify that with? What Nigerian group, ethnic group?
Yoruba.
That's right. Are you Yoruba, my brother? I am not. Did we say yes? Book.
You said a Yoruba now.
The results have just come back.
Now, you know, talking about trichonology, when I sent the man's photograph in to the press with the name, his name, and the photograph was down at the Harold Washington Library Center, somebody down at the University of Missouri Press said, the man's name must be A period, D period, E period, Jackson. No, his name was Ade. Just Sade, better known as Sade, the singer. Sade is Yoruba. He lived out way on the west side in the Austin area. But this is a man who was in the Army in the 1890s. Served down in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. Ade Jackson.
You got a soldier too over there by the Fox River. Where is that? The Mary Lincoln is the little museum right there on Fox River. They have a Civil War black guy's uniform and stuff.
And it might be that guy. I don't know what I did with something. I'm always learning something. We're here, we're there, we're what? Everywhere.
Green eggs and
You know what happened today? There was a young woman I met last week who ran for mayor. They kicked off the ballot.
yeah.
And so, very nice. Yeah, lives on the west side, down at home in the Warren. So she emailed me. She's going to be coming to meetings. I told her she could meet a good group. And I mentioned to her, because she's Igbo, that there was a man in Chicago. I know one man who was Igbo, Robert Abbott, the defender. Yeah. But supposedly in 1863, Martin Delaney, who I thought was Igbo, but his mother supposedly was Mandingo. That doesn't mean his father wasn't Igbo. Martin Delaney came to Chicago in 1863 in African regalia to recruit blacks to go back to Africa. He had been over there, signed some treaties with Africans, and he wanted to take as many blacks as he could back to Africa. And it's in the Tribune. March 19th, March 20th, March 21st, 1863, Chicago Tribune. I looked at it on the online, ProQuest. So anyway, back to this though, frontier period. How did blacks end up in Chicago? Why would somebody come here?
Jobs. Work.
Work. If you were free and you wanted to lead the South and not be hassled come up to the north. The north was free, wasn't it? Illinois was a free state, even though they allowed slaves to come in across the river, the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers, to work from time to time in southern Illinois. But it was a free state. That's why they want to come in. The farther you get away from Cairo and St. Louis, the better. Was there slavery here?
Yes.
No. No slavery in Chicago.
No.
There's an incident, there's one incident.
This by City Hall they saw.
No, that incident was where the man was, this city had a lot of southern whites, but it had a lot of New England whites. That particular man named Heathcock is in his book. He was sold for a quarter. The anti-slavery whites dominated. In fact, they would even mob the pro-slavery whites in Chicago. The state was supposed to be anti-slavery. I'm sorry, devoid of slavery, because your attitude is something else. Let me get off the subject. The man who owned McCormick Place, the man who, the original McCormick, Cyrus, was a slaveholder in Virginia. But he lived in Chicago. He created his reapers up here by the Merchandise Mart. In fact, he was supposedly, I'm going to research this, helped by a black man named Jim in creating the reaper, which was used up in the north. But he also used it down south where he grew wheat on his plantation. His slaves grew wheat. What can't a slave do? Well, a slave is just a person who's lost his or her control, right? So you had intellectuals. You had people who could help in medicine and printing. Or the fire department at Charleston, South Carolina was a slave fire department. I tell white people, what are you talking about? A slave isn't born. The guy didn't create slaves. This is some phony relationship that people that abuse power institute.
Dr. Reed, you remember that guy that came to IIT to talk about blacks who came as speaking and writing Arabic, and they thought the guy was crazy, but found out he was writing in Arabic? You know, that Timbuktu situation.
I know the story. I don't remember that, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah, many of the people from Africa, they were Muslims. In fact, as many Muslims, some say, were brought over as non-Christians. And the pressure was to what? Become a Christian, or at least,
Persuade.
yeah, once people were made into slaves. But no slavery in Chicago. So this one black man was, and there was a case of a white man who was a vagrant. His services were going to be sold. It's a different selling services versus selling a person. So that white man's services were to be sold. Later was a black man who was sold for 25 cents, and as soon as the man bought him, he said, "Hey, go back to work," because he's been working.
Wasn't that Mayor Ogden that purchased him?
There was somebody in the crowd, yeah. So there was no slavery in Chicago. This town had a reputation as being the sinkhole of abolitionism. A stinking nigger-loving town. That's what the Southerners called it. A stinking nigger-loving town. But they actually had white mobs that beat up bounty hunters and white sheriffs who came hunting slaves. Because you can make a good living hunting down runaway slaves. This young man over here, there was a runaway slave. Can you stand up, young man? There was a runaway slave, 5 feet 5.
I'm not running, man.
Hold it, you got a favor you owe me. I'm gonna tell you about it later. Hold it, keep standing. Does he fit the description? Let's see, 5 feet 5, mulatto with blonde hair and blue eyes, real thin. Is that him? Yeah, that's him, because it's $1,000 bounty on Yeah, this guy owes me a big favor, so I might have him dance at him. Hey, look, by the way, let me correct people. Set another time. No doctor here, because what we do is, this is, as I wrote to that lady today, the Igbo lady on the west side, I said, look, you just come here, you learn about us as a community. We don't have any titles.
Okay.
That's why we have a discussion going rather than a lecture. And now, because we are who we are, we can laugh and joke and still get the job done. There's nothing wrong with smiling as you work, or as we used to do on the river, sing. Loading those river boats, or out in the fields, we'd sing. That didn't mean we were happy. It meant we could use a device that we've chosen to get a job done. Here we use informality and brotherhood and sisterhood. Oh, no, they call me General Secretary. That's my title.
You're bringing up some interesting stuff, because, you know, slavery isn't a thing that you have to be ashamed of. See, what's a shame really is when you think about how Europeans came over. They were sent over. America was a penal colony just like Australia.
Yeah.
They sent their dissidents over here. They sent everybody who was rejected, whether they were insane or criminal or religious or fanatics or whatever, they sent them here. We came over. We were brought over here. We were brought over here working in the field, doing our job, being intellectually right.
Yeah.
And they came over morally wrong to a great extent.
There's a story, Benjamin Manica's mother or grandmother was sent to jail. She had a job to do, had so much material, I guess they making bowls. Because she didn't have the proper number of bowls done at the end of the day, I think something had broken, she was accused of theft. That's, you know, you've seen the stories out in England where she was sent to jail and she was to be hanged. There are like over 100 offenses that led to your hanging in Europe. I mean, it wasn't difficult to get, just like black men today. And so when they found out she could read and write, they sent her, they transported her, that's what they called it, to America. A lot, as Townsend said, a lot of people that came over here with backgrounds that we would call criminal.
Yeah.
Now their system was criminal, but they were criminals. So you're right about that.
I just want to say one thing, to piggyback on your comment. I like the concept of an enslaved people as opposed to being slaves.
That's excellent.
Because a slave is a mindset. Yeah.
Right.
And so if you're an enslaved person, then you still have your faculties, you can force back to
correct.
your freedom. You're a human being, and you know that you're a human being.
That's how we should teach it. Enslaved people.
In fact, I want to join the sister's point to say that when I talk about our history, I won't allow students of whatever age to use the term slave, because I tell them it's a lie. That our foreparents were mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and doctors and teachers and farmers and architects and priests and probably some scofflaws who by the force of terror were made to be enslaved. There's a big difference, right?
That's right.
So, but when you teach that you are the descendants of slaves,
Right.
it sounds as if you're the descendants of those who have never achieved, those who have never done, those who have never owned.
Right.
And to segue to another point about the writing and the use of Arabic script.
Yeah.
Not all of those who were writing in Arabic were Muslim. They had been students at universities and schools where Arabic script would have been the language of instruction. So just because they use the Arabic script does not, in and of itself, attest to a religious devotion or tradition. It does attest to education and training. And some of those who would have been non-Muslims would have gone to places like in Mali and other places where they were studying. Yes, and they would have been instructed in Arabic.
Good point. Good point. That's a good point. So let's see. In terms of numbers, there are always a small number of people of African descent here. Either those that in my book, I always distinguish between those that had certificates saying they had freedom under law, and then those that ran away and arrived in Chicago as quote-unquote fugitives. Now, if you had papers, you had to carry your papers all the time. You had to have them on you. Any white person could stop you. So like, and I tell students, why do the police stop you, young black men? They're doing their job. They're supposed to keep you off. They are the patty rollers of today, the patrollers. That's their job. But I didn't do anything. It doesn't matter. They have a job to do. Keep you off balance. Before you can stop and think and organize and what? Assume your rightful place on this earth as somebody in charge of something.
Dr. Reed, why do you think that some of our folks don't believe in carrying IDs or even like voting? Because when a couple of my guys grew up on the block, I bought them wallets. And then I asked one day, one young man, I said, where's the wallet I bought you? He said, oh, it's at home. I don't have any money. That's how you know you're not going to find a couple of dollars and it won't have any place to put it. My point is, though, they don't care. If you ask a young man right now on the block, they don't carry wallets. So they don't have IDs, for one thing, and you have to have an ID.
Yeah, because
I don't care if you're raking your grass.
you can be kept track of. That's the whole
apartheid has
thing. By the way, we have kids now, right? If you have a child, right now the child has to have a social security number, right? And pretty soon it's going to be a chip along with that. Yeah. So to keep track. But the patter rollers, the patrollers, the paddy rollers, they're still around.
Well, you know, that paddy came also from Ireland. Those first police, the police were hired to bring back runaway slaves anyway. That's how they came to being. So their job is to always antagonize and bring back black people no matter what. But they were Irish because the Irish were in a Western sense, and they didn't like them either. So they became the police, and they're still the police, the old Harahans, and the old Valleys, and the old Trues, and that kind of thing.
Being recorded. Channel get us all in trouble. Hey, look, you can guess at this. You don't have to have an answer. We got people here who have certificates, and you register down at City Hall as soon as you get into Chicago. Really, when you cross into Illinois, you're supposed to put up a bond, $1,000, $1,500, $2,500 bond. Otherwise, you could be what? Your services could be sold. You're a virtual slave. So we got people up here who have certificates and those that don't. How comfortable do you think life was in Chicago? You're right. Couldn't have been too comfortable. Always. What's that word again?
Cautious.
Always cautious. Because you could be snatched, just like Brother Kimball here is not 5'5", and could be what? Sold for that guy? Even if you had papers, somebody could grab your papers and say that they didn't see them and sell you in slavery. And that goes for women too. I mentioned the case of a woman seen one night with her kids on the street, not seen anymore after that. You can make a living coming to a place like Chicago, snatching black people, getting them out of the state and selling them as slaves. That was a fact. That's documented.
Well, he is a slave.
Yeah, that's documented. Now let's see, so life wasn't that comfortable, but to make it somewhat comfortable, Brother Kimball, would you point to the first man over there?
Abram?
Yeah, this is the man who started Quinn Chapel. This helped make life somewhat comfortable. Our religious belief, our spirituality has brought us through. God is good. Anybody want to challenge that?
I'd like to challenge.
Watch yourself, brother.
I want to challenge a piece of it. And I think that's tough. That's tough.
Watch yourself.
And have studied under some of her teachings. I want to challenge for it. Part of what I want to say to you is, I'll let our brother Francis.
Probably a bill collector.
He's delayed, so he didn't have to answer it.
No. Part of what I want to challenge is, you talked about our religious beliefs have sustained us, because that's what I want to challenge.
Right.
I'm challenging that all of those who were associated with houses of worship and faith might not have necessarily professed the faith, but under that guise, they could meet. And I'll bring a contemporary example and then take it back. In South Africa, they would meet in houses of faith and worship because it's where the ANC, their comrades could meet. Not because they were devotees of Christ, but it's where they could meet. So I would suggest that maybe at Quinn Chapel,
great point,
you might have had something.
Well, let me suggest this to you, Sherry Williams, who belongs to Quinn Chapel. I don't think you're going to be inviting him over, will you? I wouldn't say that over
Not just the brother because he's bringing truth to the table.
I actually would like to weigh in on his commentary because through oral history, which I've now been able to find documents to support it, that's how our family in Mississippi established an AME church. My first ancestor who came here from what we now call Liberia and Sierra Leone, my ancestry 100% African, yes, has been able to use the church as a way to have spiritual expression. But through oral history in my family, they all wrote Arabic and they all returned to their African names when slavery ended. Now, I found that quite confusing in Mississippi, and especially in the Delta. My family was born, my mom actually was born and lived in Inverness, Mississippi. And they established an AME church, which still stands, which we still have the deed to from 1890. But their practice was Christian fellowship, but they embraced and operated as though they practiced Islam. So they ate and had regiments and prayer similar to what you see with those who practice Islam. So again, the meeting place had lots of dynamics. And it was completely a Christian-based faith practice.
So if I could go a step further even, I would say that what we saw in New Orleans, because of the pressure, and what we saw in Hispaniola, we call it now, but I remember San Domingo, Santo Domingo. For example, we saw the pressure to keep African folks out of houses of worship, out of any sort of their own worship tradition. They masked their traditions behind the Catholic idols. But in the case of the U.S., where we could start our own churches, the mask was, it had a different tone and color to it. So it wasn't exactly the same thing, because we could bring drums if we wanted, or we could, so it was a different way of trying to.
Well, imagine how bold to have a Black Jesus mural in a congregation that's been there since 1891. This is radical thinking about who you look at as a deity. And the AME Church has always had that platform that Jesus is an African and that we are African. To put in the name of your congregation, African Methodist Episcopal, just shows that there was clarity about their identity, their racial identity. And I found that profound growing up as a kid, that my grandmother would remind me all the time that I was African. And I thought other people knew that too. So, when I started going to other congregations, and especially when my mom decided it important for me to go to Catholic school as a kid, the entire Mass was done in Latin, and we went to Mass 5 days a week. But God is a God that can bring clarity through that confusion of hearing Latin every day, by going to a Catholic church, that I came to know God in quite a different way. So
that's interesting. Let me ask you this, Tad, this is excellent. Tad, into that, in Chicago, you could have gone to church, and people did go to church with whites. You could go to the Baptist dominated here. It started out as a Roman Catholic city, but then more and more people came in from New England and up in Ohio, and it became Protestant. With Baptists, with the Methodists being number one. White Methodists, then the white Baptists. And a black could go to church with them, but then you have by 1844 a small band of these people saying they wanted to be Methodist, Episcopal, only blacks. And then later, in the 1850s, blacks started two Baptist churches under their own leadership. What's this thing from the Bible under your fig and vine? How's it go? Operate, you should worship under your own fig and vine, something like that. Anyway, this ties into our discussion. This sense of independence comes out as they start black churches in an environment where you could attend church with whites if you wanted to.
One clarification. Are you telling me that in AME churches they had black images?
Yeah, we have.
Is that consistently? Because I've been in black Protestant churches, and they have, and since the '60s they've been getting black images, but they had white Jesuses and
She said
all the black faces on
so all the AMEs.
No, not all. No. No.
And you know what's funny? Your family comes out of AME roots. Your mother told me this. Yeah.
My mother.
Yeah, your mother. My mother too.
I remember.
Your mother said that. She told me once. Okay, she told me. She's my mother.
She didn't keep it a secret from me.
Okay, she told me. But I mean, because I knew them as Catholics.
Yes.
Your father being a Catholic. Yeah.
I just want to point out briefly that Abram Hall's descendants from the 1840s still in Chicago today.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
The fellow
Well,
Quinchapel.
probably,
The
the founder of Quinchapel, yeah,
Yeah.
the descendants still live here, yeah.
Are they still on 50th Street? Is that what it is?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
The one daughter, one of the brothers just died a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, let's move on. This is interesting. On the frontier period, with a question, you can't keep a good man and woman down, so therefore this man and woman by the name of Atkinson, whose photographs I don't have here, but I do have, ended up starting a cab or taxi or carriage service in the 1850s. Why not? Huh? Why not follow the path of DuSable, whether you heard of him or not? And one black man went down to the corner of Randolph and the lake every day, filled up his wagon with water, and brought the wagon back into town and sold the water. By the way, the water from the river was polluted. So therefore, if you want to clear water, you buy from the waterman. This was a black man. Then another black man had a stable. Another black man had a bathhouse. A black woman had a rooming house. So there's no activity, no endeavor, no effort, no dream that what the African can't make come true. That's it in a nutshell. Dare to struggle, dare to dream, dare to win. And there was one doctor here, Dr. Hutchinson, and there was one black dentist before the Civil War. And there was one black man who came here. A lot of this stuff I didn't know, by the way. In 2015? 40 years ago, I started the first class on black history in the Chicago area. I did it out at Northern Illinois University. I didn't know doodly squat. And there were books around, I didn't know where they were. The books weren't hidden or stolen. They were, the stuff was around. We just didn't know how to use it. So we used the Defender, which was pretty good. And back there, way back with Red on that thing, the Defender in the 30s started asking old black people, what do you remember about the old days in Chicago? So the Defender was right up front, trying to recover our old history. But we are go-getters to the extreme. All right, so by the 1860s, the Civil War came, 1861 to 1865. Let's see, who was Mother Moore? Where's Miss Mother Moore? Mother Moore. Oh, I'm sorry, here she is right here. Here, this is a question, we just passed around. Look at her and tell me who she is. Now you got to think about, what am I talking about? Who is she? Look at her. It's right here. Looking at her photograph, what traits would you imagine she possessed? You pass that around.
She was a religious woman?
She was what?
A religious woman?
Yeah, religious. No, we're not talking about traits, no, bloodline. We're talking about personality traits. Does she look strong? Does she look resolute?
Truly.
That's right. Yeah, she looks, that's what we're talking about. Who is? If you know, yeah, you're just not an ordinary person. She's Mother Moore, resolute. There were so many AMEs in Quinn Chapel. The other folks, they started coming into town during the Civil War from the Deep South, and when the war was being fought, and so they wanted a second church. So Mother Moore and others started Bethel AME Church. So now with 2 AME churches in town. This is all downtown, what we call downtown. And then there were the 2 Baptist churches merged into one big Baptist church called Olivet. Olivet Baptist, that's my family's old church, over here at 31st and King Drive, which originally, like, everybody lived down in what do we call the South Central, down Federal Building, around the Metcalf Building. You know, so many structures named after black people in Chicago, it's insane. the Harold Washington Social Security building. I said, look, isn't that there was a statue, Richard Hunt's statue, I Will, down there by, wow, Stroger Hospital. What's that, the VA hospital, what's his name?
Yeah, I can see.
Jesse, Malcolm X College. I started getting
His first
nervous
name
with
is
all the
Jesse
things named
something.
after black people. And these schools just proliferate. Your civic buddy Goodlow, they named the school after her. Professional women. Elaine Goodlow. Yeah, I mean, it's just so many structures named after black people. I would assume that you black people have what? Assumed into yourself enough power to get things named after people you like.
I just got through reading a book called Our Kind of People, and it tells about the accomplished blacks, the elites, the organizations they belong to, how they socialize, what churches they belong to, you know, the Jack Penfield and the Leeds and the Ule and all. But the churches that they belong to mainly is Episcopalians and Congregational.
Right. Yeah. The bulk of the African American population, though, belongs to Pentecostal, Evangelical, AME, Baptist, whatever, AMEZ. Yeah.
It seems like when they acquired some status, they didn't like to wait.
You're not pointing at me because I was in the Presbyterian church. Are you?
I'm sorry.
Because you're not pointing at me because I'm a Presbyterian.
No, you're not Episcopalian.
No, a Presbyterian is very high. I always pull that out among whites, that I was baptized on the corner at Central Presbyterian. That's high status. You're right. Episcopalian, Congregational, Presbyterian churches rank. Although you must remember, John D. Rockefeller was a what?
Baptist.
A Baptist, Riverside Baptist. And they used to call University of Chicago Rockefeller Baptist College. Yeah. So it really depends on how much you got in your pocket. You can be, or this brother would say, maybe you don't believe in anything but this. And maybe I carry this as protection. Oh boy. Okay. So anyway, I think we understand with Mother Moore, she was typical of people in Chicago during the war. And there was, see the next thing, that lady there, that gray hair, that was Mrs. Hudlin. When the fire came after the war, and that's the home they had in the 1850s. If other people could have homes, they could have a home. They took in people, 2 or 3 families, including the white family or 2, after the fire when most of the city was burned. They called her the fire angel, that black lady.
Wasn't something about her husband saving some records?
Yeah, he saved a lot of records. Had a portrait of him painted, put it in the old boardroom. It's no longer there, but they had a portrait made of the man. He saved records. Yeah, Joseph Hudlin. They're well known down in the Catholic community in St. Louis, the Hudlins. How many more Mother Moores were there in Chicago during the war? Right, yeah. We have plenty of Mother Moores, and we got strong men too. We have strong men and we have strong women. I repeat that for anybody that didn't hear it. Would they have expected their men to fight to end slavery? Yes. Turner, would you point to the soldier? With the Camp Douglas group. And this is actually a photograph of a man believed to have been a Civil War soldier from Chicago. The man at the bottom is Mr. Griffin's grandfather. Griffin's funeral home? That's his grandfather, yeah.
Good. Dr. Reed, the person I was talking about, came from Batavia.
Okay.
That's where his uniform is. Listed somewhere over there, by the Fox River.
Okay. Yeah, this particular unit, infantry, included men not just from Chicago, but from up and down the Fox River and from downstate Illinois. Before they organized the 29th Infantry Regiment, black men had been registering. This is odd. They had been registering for the 54th Massachusetts down at the corner of Washington and Dearborn at John Jones's two-story building. So you could sign up for the Union Army anywhere. The states would send recruiters out, and you meet your state quotas. So the guys from Massachusetts came here recruiting guys in Illinois, because Illinois didn't have a black regiment. So there were about 24 men from Illinois, and some from Chicago, who fought with the 54th Massachusetts, which is a unit glorified in the movie Glory. There was also a 55th Massachusetts Infantry and a 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. They got men from everywhere. Once Illinois got its unit, 29th Infantry, this state committed itself to raising 1,000 men from the ranks of Illinoisans. So men would sign up in Chicago or come to Chicago to sign up. And by the way, you were paid when you signed up in 1864 to fight. You could get a $100 bounty, a bonus, that's what they call them, bounties. You could get a $200. Yeah, so you were paid to fight. But I always ask this question, why do you think, if these women like Mother Moore and Father Moores could try to get men to fight, what would be the inducement? Why would he tell this young man to sign up? What do you think they'd say?
You'd be free.
You'd be free?
But it's also what it says.
Yeah, but you,
What's that?
It's about masculinity too. If you're going to be a man goes out and defends his people. You know, so I think a big inducement was to demonstrate that your manliness.
Who is that man? He looks pretty manly to me. Who is that? Now, if you really owe me, you better have the right answer.
I don't know, man.
Who do you think I talk about all the time?
This your grandfather, your relative.
Okay, let's start it over again. Who do you think it is?
This is I think this is your. It looks sort of like you, man. The same that photo you carry around your wallet.
That's my great grandfather. Yeah. That book is not about him, but there was a need for a man to symbolize manhood. Here he is again. This is the greatest man who ever lived. He was a slave who got his freedom. He was enslaved, and when he signed up in 1864 down in Kentucky, he signed up with thousands of other men who had been enslaved. You know, they helped turn the tide. They were there when Robert E. Lee surrendered in the middle of the battle formation. That's why I carry that, because people will say, well, did they do any fighting? Yeah, they did fighting. And there's the final battle formation at Appomattox.
oh, they don't like that if you pull that one out, I'm sure.
I'm always pulling that out, just like I pulled this out.
Cards.
Kimball, you know what's coming out. All right. I haven't looked at this all day, come to think about it.
All day.
I need to, and I have a copy of that photograph. I've been carrying this or something like it for 50 years. Now, why did I start doing it? Leroy Kennedy, why did I start doing it? Carrying a photograph of my great-grandfather 50 years ago.
Just keep thinking about the family tree.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. I just started doing it about 50 years ago. Every day, I was carrying this. Now, this is as the other one got worn, this is another copy. That's my great-grandmother. They were both slaves down in Kentucky. Emancipation Proclamation didn't free them. But when a man joined the Army after 1864, he was free, and then 6 months later, they freed her and my great aunt, the child. They were rotten. The man was in the service, and the families were starving outside the fort where they were training. Then they were so embarrassed in the North, they said, okay, the wives and children can be free too. Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. Didn't free almost any slaves. It was a political document. It's what they call trichology. A political document meant to undermine the white Southerners' confidence in their war effort.
And the economy, their economy.
Yeah, I mean, and the blacks had been slowing down anyhow, and then men were escaping to join the Union Army. Food production was down, and you had to worry about the black men rising up. So this making them know what they were doing. Only people that were to be freed by the Emancipation Proclamation were people in areas under the control of the Confederate Army. Well, blacks took things in their own hands and started leaving those areas, yeah.
That's a quick question. One of the things we know, right, is that it wasn't uncommon for women to follow soldiers around, follow camps around.
Right, yeah.
What was your great-grandmother following?
They followed them to Camp Nelson, where they were training in Kentucky. They didn't follow them to Virginia, though. They were besieging Petersburg, which is about an hour's drive south of Richmond. I think it's south. I've been there. But there's no women there. But women did. And look, generals had their wives in camp with them. And they didn't fight every day like you see fighting today when people shooting. You fight in the right season, see? This is cold weather. Nobody was going to be fighting in weather like this. But the women camp followers, and women who were looking for husbands, women looking for extra change, women that wanted to make money, cleaning clothes or cooking. Yeah, camp followers.
That's where the word hooker comes from.
Yeah, General Hooker, the women following General Hooker. Yeah.
There's a street north of Halsted called Hooker.
Well, hold it now, let's not get to it.
No, I mean, that's where FedEx is, you know.
Shut your mouth, girl.
You can go see for yourself. Put that in your next book.
I want to talk a little more about this. I want to just raise the subject. I want to hear a little bit more about this. I wanted you to finish the point. Our brother said it was to support masculine identity.
Yeah.
To assert.
Right.
On one case, I would argue that it would be to refute a notion of inferiority.
Yeah, okay.
So the sentiment, I understand maybe the book would be able to contextualize it in the layers I'm probably not to ask about. But what is happening in Chicago when there's this draw to come down to Washington and Dearborn streets at the time when ostensibly there may have still been bounty hunters? Some might still.
Oh, no. Well, I mean, remember now, overall the climate was one where white folks, if they saw somebody try to grab you in the daytime, they might jump the bounty hunter.
Okay.
That was the thing. In fact, I found a document a number of years ago where a white guy wrote, this is 10, 12 years after the Civil War, he said, let's get together, this is a white guy writing to a white guy, all the people who were anti-slavery, all the abolitionists. He said, if my memory serves me correct, Chicago is the only city where there were mobs of whites that got together to chase bounty hunters and sheriffs and deputies out of town. Because ordinarily, when you read black history and American history, mobs get together to what? Beat up black people and kill them. Philadelphia, Cincinnati, New York. Opposite. But why would you say that's the case? It had to do with the way the white people thought. Now, not the white Southerners like McCormick, Cyrus McCormick. But if you came from New England, the bed of abolitionism, anti-slavery thought, or from upper New York State, Buffalo, Rochester, all the way over to Albany, that was their thinking. Western Reserve, where Cleveland is, that's how they thought. They were anti-slavery, and they came to Chicago to live. And then religiously, by the 1770s, in the white man, the Northern European man, it was no longer a case of you're being a slave because you exemplified sinfulness. It was now if you held slaves, you were exhibiting signs of sinfulness. They had a deliberate shift intellectually and religiously. So these New Englanders became anti-slavery throughout the country. Remember, there was slavery throughout America until the 1770s, 1780s. Then there's this big shift. You are sinful if you hold slaves, another one of God's creatures, in bondage. Previously, if you were a slave, that was a demonstration, a display, a sign that you were guilty of sin. Yeah. So these people here were a little different in Chicago.
So there's a fuel of a moral righteousness there.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, and then it gets to a point where the white people like John Brown say, those whites who hold slaves are pulling us down in the ass of guys.
Now, that's where I was wondering.
Yeah, they're pulling us down the ass of guys.
Right.
Well,
Holding people as slaves.
Many Rivers to Cross is on all day today, and they just covered that. They talked about the great spiritual revival that helped to stir up the whole abolitionist movement, because the whites did start to repent of
The sin, they were in sin just being in the country where the slavery.
The issue about masculinity is for a second.
Yeah.
You know, around the 1870s, you started seeing the black militias and the black National Guard.
Right.
You know, making these same arguments. And we see police and fire, and I would see them doing the militia movement. Like all other ethnic groups had their own army. Black folks were doing the same thing right after.
What was the name of that first militia?
Oh, it was something in French that I don't know.
No, we already mentioned.
It was a Hannibal Guard.
That's it,
Yeah,
the Hannibal Guard.
They called it something else.
Notice they were the Hannibal Guard. That was it. They were the Hannibal. Yeah, that's the group that the 8th Regiment down the street here on 35th and Giles. They finally became part of the National Guard, that militia unit. See, what did you just say, brother Kimball? Every group what?
Every ethnic group had their own neighborhood militia, had their neighborhood army, their ethnic army.
Yeah, they had arms.
And black
and
folks
everything.
are the same thing.
Yeah, they were supposed to be there in time of emergency, a fire, flooding, something, tornado, and they were armed. They were supposed to help the regular army. So we had ours during this period. And that group becomes what eventually becomes the 8th Infantry Regiment of the Illinois National Guard.
Can you go back, you went real quickly over that Black Fire. Can you do that again?
Yeah, that's around where the Metcalf building is now, at Clark and Van Buren. Yeah, some Jewish people had a yard or something where they collected items and flammables and gasoline, kerosene was down there. And this fire came up. This is 3 years after the big Chicago fire. And it was pretty furious, but it burned not all of Chicago, but the south part of Chicago, all the way down past, I guess, to Roseville Road. And all that blacks lived. See, blacks weren't touched that much by the first fire.
Show them that map you have in there.
Oh, there's a map here. Yeah, blacks weren't touched. You can see it. Yeah, blacks in the front is here. Yeah, but the second fire, what some of our black people call the Black Fire, is the second Chicago, wiped us out. And one of the firemen was killed, by the way, burned to death. And the firehouse was burned down too. This headed south. The other fire went north up to where the water tower is. And by the way, there were black heroes during the fire, the Chicago fire. Some blacks helped prevent looters, mainly whites. There were cavalry, white cavalry riding around. They were dynamiting places to keep it from spreading. But that second fire really wiped us out, so that's how we got on the south side. We started out downtown where everybody else was. And there had already been a few blacks living west. So the oldest black settlement is west along Lake Street. The second oldest is this area here, the Black Belt. My map calls the area around 18th Street. That's darkest Africa. That's where the working class and very poor blacks live, darkest Africa. Then you had the Black Belt forming in the 1900s. How about school teachers? Do we have school teachers? Of course, but you imagine it, you do it. This is what's messed up with our bands. We so surprised. Yeah, they dream it, they do it. Take a piece of string, some gum, an old sole of a shoe, and make a car. For you young people here, I'm exaggerating only what is true. My father had a barber shop down here on 35th Street. When he came up from Arkansas to East St. Louis, up to Gary over here, he said, I don't want to work for anybody. I want to be my own man. So he went to Phillips High School at night, went to college, barber college. That's a joke. He got barber college. And got his own shop, 3 chairs, Reed Barber Shop. Go get it. That's what we all about. Go get us. Not satisfied with a little or nothing. So we had school teachers. By the way, people don't know this, but you could go to school in Chicago before the Civil War. You couldn't do that in New York or Boston, but you could go to school in Chicago.
There was no public school system in those cities?
There wasn't, but they didn't allow blacks in. So like in New York, the blacks set up their own schools, the free African schools. Here you could go to public school. And of course you could face discrimination, but you go to school. And then there was one black school teacher by the Civil War, and then, but officially, the first black school teacher is recognized as coming in. She's in that book by the 1870s. Why would professionals such as Edward, the Iron Master, Wright, have migrated to Chicago? Why would blacks come here after the Civil War? It's obvious. Opportunity. Not only could we make opportunities, but we could know how to take advantage of opportunities.
What about reputation?
Well, the city had a good reputation, that it wasn't, you weren't going to be mayor. It took us until what year to get a mayor?
83.
You everybody hear?
83.
83. Took us until 1983.
We didn't make that for you.
So it's been uphill. I mean, it has not been, what did Langston you said, wasn't a crystal stair, was it? It wasn't a crystal staircase. Living in Chicago did not bring you to a place where there was a crystal stair. But we go get us.
I'm sorry. How inspirational was the knowledge of DuSable and how Chicago was able to develop businesses and to...
Well, somebody
continue
answer
to this
that.
point?
Not knocking you, Brother John Town, but you came in late.
Okay.
Tell him what? Spank him.
No, he left because he was starting to get feeling an infringement of American and cavalry and retreating, taking over this part of the country, making it officially under the U.S. jurisdiction, where black folks then didn't have any rights,
Right.
so it was time to get out of Dodge before they came in and took over.
Yeah. So he wanted to know, though, was there DuSable legacy to inspire blacks that follow?
Even to this day?
Probably not until recently.
No.
Until,
That's yes.
that's a yes.
Yeah.
It is now, because we're talking about it now.
Yeah. People been, and notice the thing you got, the blue sheet is what? 1903, isn't it?
That's what I was trying to see the date on that.
1903. Yeah.
It was,
Okay.
go back to your question, you said, why would they come here?
Yeah.
Well, if you think about 33% of the city was burned in 1871 and another 10%
Yeah.
3 years later.
Yeah.
This is a huge opportunity to remake something. I mean,
Right.
think about what last week with the Pullman monument. Right? Why did George Pullman come here? I mean, there's opportunity, there's money to be made here.
Right. In fact, see the Pullman thing over there? I mean, I would have been a Pullman porter, like my grandfather, because, hey, when have we ever had it so great? But here, you can travel if you're a Pullman porter. You had to say yes, sir, and no, sir, and smile. What's new? You know what I'm saying? You were underpaid and worked long hours. What's new? But it beat what? As my father said, I'm not going to work picking cotton in Arkansas all my life. We had the bulk of all Pullman porters in this city by 1900, because all the trains came here. So guys came here to be Pullman porters.
You use the term city of refuge several times.
Yeah.
Is that an official term, or is that?
I don't know. You know, when you do a lot of research, you either see things, like here in the meetings, I'll hear something.
Yeah.
Like, what's the term? Josella O'Mary. What's that term you use instead of slaves? And then Sherry Williams, what's the term instead of, what's that term? Instead of tied into that?
Freedom seekers.
You hear things, and so you might use them. Forgot where you got them. Plus, you don't want to give credit to those two beautiful young ladies. You want to whenever, I don't know, city
We
rep.
don't know who to
like,
give credit to either, because it didn't start, it's not our terminology.
what's that?
We don't know who to give credit to either, because it's not our original thinking. We got it from somewhere.
Well, that Tilly Turner,
You don't,
absolutely.
yeah, but I mean, I think, you don't think yours was original?
Freedom secret.
When did you start using it?
I heard it in a lecture context.
Oh, I see, I see.
Either a lecture or TV or something, anyway.
Okay, yeah.
In a context. It
It's a
didn't
lot-
start with me.
There's a lot of good ideas floating around. I don't know why, I can't remember.
You know, what I'm thinking of,
I love that.
what I'm thinking about is listening to the conversation about how Chicago was the refuge and
Right.
how folks felt about slavery and so this whole shift to Chicago being the most segregated city. I mean, how did you see that?
Excellent question. It became fashionable in the 1960s to talk about where the worst place was to live. Now, if you got any age on it, you know every place is the worst place. When I went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where the big battle had taken place, the blacks were segregated there. When I went to so-and-so, the blacks were segregated there. Everywhere you go, you're at the most segregated city. And then something else about Chicago, groups have always separated from each other in Chicago. We have a Swedish colony, Andersonville up north. The Poles live along Milwaukee and Polonia. The Italians live in Little Italy. The Chinese live in Chinatown. The Jewish people live in the Maxwell Street district. Everybody had their own enclave, and guess what we developed? Our own enclave, not a ghetto. Our community, we named it, we just call it the South Side. Now they call it Bryanteville. When I met Paula Robinson here, she explained to me that the city fathers, in trying to develop the South Side, weren't going to settle for anything other than a nice sounding name, right? So you told me when I met you, I don't know, 15 years ago, oh, that's how the Bryanteville thing came in. I was born here. I never heard of Bryanteville.
What
we
about
had I mean, there certainly was things that documented the mayor of Bronzeville,
Yeah.
Gwendolyn Brooks wrote a whole poem about a street in Bronzeville, but people like Vernon Jarrett and Chuck Bowen said, Paula, at the time, if you had told us we were from Bronzeville, those were fighting words. That was not something that we,
Well, everybody in the country knew South Side. You were from the South Side of
That's what it
Chicago.
was.
Huh?
No, I said that's what it was. It was just the South Side.
The South Side. Everybody in the country knew about the black people and how well they were doing on the South Side of Chicago.
Sinclair
They
Drake,
said,
Black Metropolis.
talks about
And he said
Bronzeville.
it, yeah, but he wasn't a Chicagoan. He picked it up and put it in the chapter title. But if you saw the letter that Harold Lucas got from St. Clair
Yeah,
Drake,
see.
he said, I'm surprised you're interested in this. Because he never taught a class at Roosevelt University on Black Metropolis. That wasn't even his interest. The book was put together, and this is another story, because people at the University of Chicago wanted to have a survey of what caused blacks to become juvenile delinquents. And they had 200 researchers out there researching everything in the black community. And then Drake wrote it up, all these research findings, and then he put this nice title on this chapter, which was one of his best chapters to me, called Bronzeville. But we just lived on the South Side, that's it.
But when you talk
Well,
about-
Blackbelt, Tim Black says that we lived in the Black Belt.
Right. In John Johnson's book, though, when he talks about coming from, is it Arkansas?
Yeah, he's from Arkansas.
And he talks about this orientation of Bronzeville as well. I've been doing some research on just the Bronzevilles that are around the country. I have a website called Bronzeville USA. And just capturing the information about the Bronzeville out in California. It's also known as Little Tokyo, what's going on in Milwaukee, and there are other places in Cleveland, a few other places. But it's kind of interesting how they've all picked up that name.
Bronzeville.
And it's almost like what you would see, it's almost like what you see with these migration cities, where in the emancipation communities, you were calling them things like Freetown.
Yeah, down in Houston.
Right, so.
See, I've got to say this, because see, that's part of the story that we were talking about. We had evolved the name from South Side to Mid-South to Bronzeville. It was something that was done very conscientiously with a lot of the community groups and institutions here, in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, 80s and 90s.
And it came back from the community.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's,
But, you know,
but that is at the same time when the city started saying, we've got Chicago's New East Side, or we've got West
Right,
Side, and we've
right.
got these new neighborhood names that
Right.
weren't even, we just knew the West Side, or,
right.
you know, over by Wacker Drive, and all this started happening because that was the marketing.
Yeah,
That
but
was
we didn't have an
marketing.
east side. We never had an east side.
That's what the city was starting to market
Yeah.
for the city. So that was at the time we started doing things out here.
Yeah.
And saying it evolved from the south side to mid-south, and then,
Near south.
well, the near south was kind of there anyway, anything north of 12th Street. But it was the mid-south that
Yeah.
went through a whole other change from the late 80s, early 90s. And then that's when we started kind of picking up Bronzeville. And we looked up one day, you had Bronzeville on the city's neighborhood maps.
Right.
And it was just there. It was not any sort of formalized
Yeah.
process. It was just there.
There, yeah.
And then we knew that it was official at that point.
Well, you know,
It was on the neighborhood
but
map.
back to the question of the most segregated city, Dr. King contributed part of that.
Yes, that's right.
But the thing about that was every place was the worst city. He said it everywhere he went, because every place was worse. There wasn't a place in this country in the 50s, 60s you could go to that was effing. We caught hell everywhere, and still do. It was legal. Yeah, you were guilty of sin staying around slaveholders. Remember the song, My Eyes Have Seen the Glory of the Coming of Love? Yeah, it's a religious song. It's a great crusade to end the sinfulness of the nation. Two things. I know I was in Washington once, and I read, you know, what was on the sign of the Lincoln Memorial. He was talking about if God wants it, thousands more will die in the name of redeeming the nation. And then I was thinking about what George Bush, the last George Bush, said in his second inaugural. Very interesting. Now his roots are New England. So in what was that? Whatever year it was, 2005, I guess. His second inaugural, which nobody would have listened to, said, the nation has lived in sin and finally purged itself with the end of slavery. That was in his inauguration address in 2005. It always sounds like a New Englander. Down in Texas, the Texans don't accept the Bushes as real Texans. They consider them interlopers. They come from anti-slavery New England. So that was interesting. He included that. He was very much aware of the sin of the nation. The way African Americans are treated today is sinful. Because you can't get ahead. No, they do get ahead doing what they do to us. It's wrong.
And one interesting thing I find when I was reading this book that I mentioned, Our Kind of People, when some of them did acquire wealth or good economic standards, they had to be very careful because this man named Church, they ran him out of Memphis, because he acquired such a great deal of wealth and what have you.
Is anybody here?
Everything he had, and you can't brag about what you have, or
I know.
you have to be very careful.
Anybody here ever had any trouble with coworkers because of something you had that they didn't have? A home that was too nice, a coat that, anybody here have that experience? Let me get a witness. How did you get that? What are you doing with that? That's still going on today.
Oh, today.
Yeah, so it's smart that you keep the fact that you have what's a big car? A Jaguar. You know, plenty of black folks got that. And there's a lot of antagonism from whites because you got it.
I wanted to piggyback off of your commentary about what the climate might have been in that era. There were anti-slavery sentiment papers that were produced in Chicago, such as the Tribune.
Right.
So there was media going out that also supported this anti-slavery sentiment, not just the church and not just the nuclear communities, but the Tribune was a vehicle for anti-slavery sentiment. And I think it was Commander Bross.
Yeah, Bross. Yeah.
Who was
that's right. Who headed the 29.
Someone of the Tribune, and he was killed with those in the
troops.
crater.
Yeah, killed with those troops down in Petersburg. Yeah.
So part of what formed the question, I'm from Kansas, and so there's this, and went to the University of Lawrence, and so there's the tradition there that even exists today between Kansas and Missouri.
Right.
While it's a rivalry now, the original fight was this question of would Africans be free?
And what the town of Lawrence was burned twice. The white people living in town were burned out twice by Missouri ruffians, right?
Let me give you another fact. The hotel that was burned down, the printing press. I was wondering if the newspapers had a role to play. Well, thank you for bringing that up. There was a printing press in the Eldridge Hotel on the corner of 8th and Massachusetts Street. Those were New Englanders who would come that way. So that was interesting what it happened here as well. So it's really informing me. The hotel was built. Every time it got burned down, he took the insurance money and added another story. When I came to work there in the 1980s to study, it was at the 5th floor. So it had been burned down 2 or 3 times. The last time he added 2 floors and said he was going to start doubling up, so they kept burning it down. But this was at the Eldridge Hotel. It was Lawrence's oldest hotel, been there since the 1850s. But this legacy that you're talking about was still there, so I started asking questions and finding out more. Soon I had to, I graduated and left. But the sentiment, and I read about it, but the sentiment of what was going on there has always intrigued me. What was the context like with all this stress, and what was it like every day?
In the book that Dr. Reed has in front of him has a map which kind of shows the connectivity that, say, Philo Carpenter, who was a deacon and also an editor for the Tribune, but he was a deacon of First Presbyterian Church. So here, again, this anti-slavery sentiment was being said in pulpits and in congregations, along with it being written through the Tribune. So there was widespread sentiment throughout Chicago about eradicating slavery. And then I can't help but think about how ingenious we are as African people to even use the waterways to get here. And so the map that's inside of the book that Professor Reed has written shows the proximity of how the waterways were right at where Philo Carpenter's house was at, and where John Jones' house was at, and where churches were also, very close to it. So they had this network of making certain that freedom seekers had shelter, had coverage, and also had access to homes and homesteads. So imagine with John Jones, people would come and they would be ragged and torn and bruised and injured. I can't even imagine the travel it would take to, say, leave the South and come from Missouri. Mostly those who came to Chicago were freedom seekers from Missouri. Had a new change of clothing. So John Jones, being a tailor, could very well give them new clothing, and they could get acclimated into the community.
Now, would that place, I'm sorry to be jumping up and talking so much, but that place was signing up, would they have been near a place where newspapers would have been distributed and sold? I'm wondering how that worked.
No, but the city was very small then. So nobody lived on the north side.
Okay.
Very few lived on the west side because there was only one bridge over there. Everybody lived where downtown is now.
Lake Street.
And they didn't live past Roosevelt Road. So they were...
it was compact.
Yeah, there were 1,000 black folks here right when the Civil War started, and there were maybe 100,000 in the city, but everybody lived, you're right in that area, yeah. Look, let's move from the Civil War.
Can you go back to just one point?
Go ahead.
I'm trying to think of the context of the speech. Every drop of blood drawn by the lash of the
that's
will
Lincoln,
be
that's it.
demanded by the sword.
That's right.
But I forget the context.
That's the second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln, 1865, in March, before he gets killed. I mean, he's talking tough about the sinfulness of the nation. Would you repeat that, Sister Mary? You just said it.
Okay.
Every
drop of blood drawn by the lash will be demanded by the sword, or whatever. I can't remember the...
That's right. Now, the Civil War claimed, though, was up to 700,000 soldiers on both sides. A lot of people died. But it was a nation living in sin, holding people in bondage. And by the way, the reason they don't want to talk about it today, why would you want to talk about how bad you, and every time the president brings up something about how imperfect the nation is, he's knocked down, being called now unpatriotic. I wish we weren't being recorded. I wish we were, because I was Paula.
The whole world can see this. Before we did the Civil War,
Yeah.
you know, Representative Monique Davis,
Yeah.
we were at something downstate, and you know, one of the things that she talks about, that we're focusing on Chicago, but she always tries to give us a better picture of the state of Illinois, and that, you know, what's going on in Chicago is different than what's going on in East St. Louis or Springfield or Carbondale or Cairo or whatever. And I don't know if I mean, in terms of the picture of just the house divided is one thing. The act, she talks about how Abraham Lincoln was really not focused on slavery until this debate started happening with Douglas.
Yeah.
You know, that Douglas was actually the you know, sort of the first Democrat in Chicago, in Illinois, to run for president. You know, and the difference of that. But she's also saying that Illinois, you know, in terms of just the freedom and emancipation, that it was just by the difference of 2 votes or something.
Back one vote, I think.
Oh, one vote.
1818 when it became a state, yeah.
I
Could have
mean,
been a
that
slave
just puts a
state.
whole nother perspective on what we think about with Illinois.
That's right.
One vote?
Yeah. When you leave Chicago, don't you feel a little uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Sherry Williams, you went all the way to Macon, Illinois, didn't you? Macomb, I'm sorry.
I mean, just to go back, just go back a little bit. I mean, you think about the division between the way Southern Illinoisans and Northern people living in the North saw slavery.
Right.
Folks in the South called people in the same state. St. Louis, right, is what they call the northernmost southern city in the United States.
Yeah.
You know, so the influence of that type of ideology,
right,
you know, was very important, and it really divided the state. So we think about this complex, these tensions between upstate and downstate, right? There's a long history to that.
That's right,
you know?
very long.
So how does that play forward now in terms of what we're looking at with, you know, a new Republican governor?
It's the same.
Yeah, that's it. It's the same. That's the thing. It was set in motion generations ago.
Yeah, it's the same.
Only addition is some suburbs that add a new dimension, more like Chicago than the South, but not of Chicago. People leave Chicago to get away from you know who, the people that are everywhere. One here, one there. Let's move on to the Reconstruction era. St. Glover.
Grover.
You know something? I was there when our family named her.
What?
I keep giving her a new name.
GR.
I know.
My father will forgive you. But look, have you started taking notes on why these 200 and some odd black folks have left Illinois? So that'll be your next book.
200,000?
Yeah, that'd be your next book. You know.
No, because I only, I do, that's modern. I don't.
You don't do modern.
No.
Yeah, but have you thought about saying this is that when they tore down,
it's not leaving Illinois, it's leaving Chicago.
Right.
Getting you out of the city limits. It's
but they have
making the middle class city.
Some have gone like east.
Yeah.
Back in the day when they tore down, Robert Taylor, they went up to north of Madison, and I'll never forget that mayor up there saying, "We're not used to this," because all those blacks skate.
Right.
So.
Some from around by the Boys Club went up there to Madison, Wisconsin.
Right.
I had relatives that went up to Minneapolis. Yeah. Let's move on though to the Reconstruction. After the Civil War, the South is being redone, rebuilt, reconstructed. Brother Reed. I remember this guy, look, when he was a kid.
My first professor in college.
He was my sister.
Let's see, reconstruct with a chance to engage in politics. What do you think blacks did? Say it again. Exactly. If you had a chance to do something, look at these two young ladies leaving, isn't this something? Leaving the, I know, I've been knowing them. I'll see you too, good seeing you.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I know they have a meeting. If you had a chance to do something, John Jones became our first county commissioner, right after the fire of 1871, and that was to be followed by a black man down in Springfield.
That's what the armory is named after?
It's J.W.E. Thomas.
One here, Jones.
No, that's.
No, that's recent. Yeah, that's
That's
recent.
General Jones.
Yeah, that's recent. He
An
was,
African-American general.
yeah, he's recent.
5-star.
Thomas, though, J.W.E. Thomas was the first guy down in downstate, 1875, 1877, I think. And so we did start getting involved in politics. By the way, we didn't have an alderman though till when? 1915, Oscar the Priest. Because we were kept out. We didn't have a state senator until 1924.
But what was the Black Ward in Chicago?
Second.
Well, they lived right in here, yeah. But
They
they,
moved it over.
yeah, no, but they were able to maneuver to keep us out
So the
until we
alderman
merged
was
for 1915.
1-5.
1915, yeah, okay. So, but we did get involved. One of the things we got out of being involved in politics, we got firemen, 1872. See the board over there, Brother Turner? We had black firemen. That's a picture of the first fire company. Those are all black men except for one white man who's the captain. That's the only, yeah, the mayor was Mayor Medill, Joseph Medill, who was fair, a fair man. He said, let's have a professional firefighting force rather than one that gets, that recruits from political, yeah, and so, right. So blacks won the fire department, 1872, and they also joined the police department, 1872, 7 years after slavery ended.
I wonder where that engine company was.
Right down at 11th and State. And they fought in the next big fire in 1874 that some black people refer to as the Black Fire. But because blacks were wiped out, that was down there by the Metcalf building, wasn't it? Yeah.
And that pushed everybody back.
Pushed all the blacks down to the south side.
Yeah, that was interesting. I mean, to go back.
This lady here, Miss
Say on 47th, it was called Grand Boulevard then.
yeah, Grand whatever.
That's a community name.
It was Grand Boulevard.
Yeah,
Community
My
name.
mother said that she met my father there.
right,
It was a long time ago. It was right
Right.
around the corner from the Regal Theater.
Right.
Because I used to work there. I volunteered when I was 10 years
Right.
old at the Regal Theater. But she said everything was happening in the street.
Everything.
Nerves and all
Right.
that. Because my dad was from Alabama and she was from
Yeah.
New Orleans. And it was really nice for a very long time, even when I was a child, volunteering in that Regal Theater and when I was 10 and 11 years old.
and before our
It
time,
was
they
classic.
had the Savoy Ballroom next to the Regal.
Yeah.
Before our time.
South Center.
Yeah, South Center, yeah. My father talked about restaurants where they played violins back in the 30s and 40s. You could eat with violins playing down there. But that was still the South Side.
Yeah, but it was beautiful, man. It was
Sin-
real nice.
Yeah, I was just gonna say,
That's real nice.
Paula and Leroy probably know this, but remember when we were dealing with Mid-South, the board had to change when we started, I think, making T-shirts, whatever we were doing, had to change the logo, or whatever you want to call it, the name Bronzeville to Restoring Bronzeville, because some guy started a clothing store or something, said he was going to sue us if we didn't change it. So some of the older, you may say more recent papers before it came down was, using Restoring Bronzeville. Then I wanted to make this other point. I interviewed a guy, and I forgot his name, but I have it at home. He was 105, and he told me that Bronzeville started, the boundaries didn't start at 31st. Bronzeville started at 12th Street.
Yeah. Well, my in-laws came from Mississippi during World War II. They lived down around 18th, 19th Street. That was Remember I said Darkest Africa was down at 18th and the 18th and I think it was 18th and Wabash. That's what they call it, Darkest Africa. And then all the way as far as we live.
If you are in a city and you're lost and you want to find a black community, look for Martin Luther King.
Or Lincoln High School.
Or Lincoln. Yeah. Let's end this because we gotta have Paula Robinson, who is up here in the front, looking like she wants to.
Paula Robinson is so happy to be going to the Pullman Porter 20th anniversary gala at the restored Parkway Ballroom. Tonight, from 5 to 9:30, Dr. Lynn Hughes is hosting the Gentle Warriors Award. And both Kurt Summers, our new treasurer, and Congressman Robin Kelly are receiving awards, along with Reverend Leon Finney and a host of others.
Okay, it's good. Let's get to the World's Fair. We all know that there's a statue out in Jackson Park. We all see the gold statue. That's just a small version of a larger statue that was out there actually down by the museum. Museum was the only permanent building left from the World's Fair of 1893. And it's important to us, as it says here, were we excluded from the World's Fair as portrayed in the famous pamphlet? Were we? No. No, I mean, we can't keep us out. We were here. And what's so interesting, I used to teach that we weren't here. I was taught that we were excluded because I saw the pamphlet.
Ida B. Wells.
That's what I said. We weren't here. Nobody wanted us. And then all of a sudden, I was at Kansas, at University of Kansas in 1994, doing research in one summer on that topic of the World's Fair. And I started finding photographs and stuff that we were. I did a book on this. We weren't there. Go ahead, Brother Joe.
I guess you want to make these middle class arguments about our inclusion in the place, right?
Yeah, because the middle class.
Was our leadership involved in that?
Right. Our leadership was disgusted because they couldn't get big jobs in the fair. The only people that got big jobs, just like today, you got to have connections and money, right? Besides skin color. So the people with all the money in Chicago were the ones running everything. We did get one man from Missouri as an alternate delegate to the group that ran it, the National Board of Commissioners. That was Hale Parker. And he had come from Ohio. His father owned a foundry in Ripley, Ohio. And so he knew about science. He had gone to Oberlin College. He was an alternate. But no blacks were in the key positions running it. So as you say, the middle class blacks who were educated were angry. And that comes out in this pamphlet title. Working class blacks just wanted jobs. So they got jobs. They got jobs clearing the land, you know, manual labor, menial labor. Then they got jobs on the fairgrounds. There were some black men who were like the black policemen without weapons. That's why I put their photograph in. The guys look good, don't they?
Yeah,
and they didn't clean spittoons and toilets. That was for the janitors to do.
Yeah, black women petitioned Mrs. Palmer to get in.
And they couldn't get in. They just got one job, mainly because they didn't have any money. Most of those black women didn't have telephones even. I said, that's interesting. If you didn't have a telephone in 1893, you know you weren't hitting on anything. You know yourself, to get into things, you got to look like you look. You wouldn't go downtown to a big meeting looking like...
me.
I don't want to say anything, Sid. No, I didn't want to say anything to you.
I Wells and enough folks were really writing about all this stuff.
But they wrote this pamphlet, and it's wrong.
Right.
They were wrong because, and by the way, that pamphlet came out before the fair even started. And like Frederick Douglass didn't write about the fair. He wrote about how horrible America was, which it was. And this man Penn didn't write about the fair. And then who's the other one? Ferdinand Barnett.
Yeah.
He did write about, Ida B. Wells wrote about lynching. And so he did talk about the black women that couldn't get administrative jobs. and this black man couldn't be a policeman, a Columbian guard. But basically, this is not about the fair. That's why I wrote a book about the fair, and blacks were here. The first building built on the fairgrounds was built by the Haitians. And they said, Frederick Douglass, why don't you act as our host? That's where the black folks hung out, where Frederick Douglass was. That's why Ida B. Wells sold the pamphlet. Paul Laurence Dunbar was there. And then, so the pamphlet is misleading, totally misleading. If you go to the Chicago History Museum, you get a whole distorted view of blacks in the fair. Because we were there. We had paintings. Lionel Kimball, what paintings did we have? Who displayed? You're right. Henry O. Tanner.
UIC just did some exhibit on this, and that's what's up at the visitor center now.
Yeah, Henry O. Tanner, who did the famous photograph.
Banjo?
Huh?
Was it the banjo, I believe?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. But you know what he did for the fair? And they got me, once again, they said, I put down first lesson on the bagpipe. They said, do you mean lesson on the banjo? No, he did first lesson on the banjo after he painted first lesson on the bagpipe, because he had studied in Paris. And he went down to the channel, Brittany, and he saw a man teaching somebody how to play the bagpipe. So he painted it, and it was on display at what we now call the museum. And also George Washington Carver put his painting, Yucca Gloriosa, on display. Won awards. And then we had Hampton Institute on display, furniture and stuff the kids had done in classrooms. Wilberforce on display. Atlanta University, dozen or more people came up, including James Weldon Johnson. And he wrote back to his school newspaper about how great it was to be in Chicago and how little racism he met, you know. He said it's a fairy city. Lights, because they had electric lights for the first time. Toilets, flush toilets on the fairground. Most Chicagoans, these are white people, went outdoors. But you could go to a flush toilet on the fairground and had electric, this and that. It was just, and they made their own water. You didn't drink water from the lake. This was purified water made just for people on the fairgrounds. So it was like a different city, white city, called White City because the buildings were painted white. That's it, had nothing to do with white people.
How much it cost them to get into?
I think it was 50 cents. 25. Well, and you had to come back more than one day. It was so much to see. And the black women from New York, they sent in an exhibit. Black women from South Africa sent an exhibit. You had black folks from West Africa, North Africa, East Africa, Cuba, Brazil, and you had the Haitian building. And then you had Frederick Douglass there every day. And then you had all these conferences.
Oh, you said a Haitian building. What do you mean?
Well, they built a building. Every country built a building on the fairgrounds. The British had a building, the French, and Haiti built a building. The first building that was constructed was the Haitian Pavilion. Germany had a building. And then states like Kentucky had a building. Most of the southern states couldn't afford to build buildings, but Kentucky had one.
But I thought they only had one day for black people.
No, that was a hustle day. There was a day for postmen, a day for milkmen, a day for the Irish, a day for the Swedes, a day for the Chinese. It was a hustle. Everybody had a day, and on that day, you were supposed to get people in. So they said, do you colored people want a day? Some colored people said, no. It makes us look like we're not part of America. We're Americans. Others say, okay. And then the white friends of the blacks told Frederick Douglass, you might as well have a day and take control of the day. Make sure it's not a watermelon festival. Make sure you don't have, make sure you don't have cake walking. But can you imagine Beyonce on our day out there shaking, rump shaking? Come on, girl. I want to see, what's that ballet, Alvin Ailey dance? Not her.
Next Friday.
Alvin Ailey. Okay, Alvin Ailey.
That was a group who wanted to celebrate King last year, a group of young people.
Yeah.
And they wanted to call it Twerking for King.
Oh yeah, I heard of that. Come on.
Twerking for King. They said no.
No, King with the, you know, and there's nothing wrong with twerking when you at home in the party on the dance floor, you know, but that's not our best. So by the way, we did have the Colored Day, Colored American Day, but it was very bourgeois. The music was high class. But blacks had been used to and stuff anyhow, and classical. And that's what Frederick Douglass wanted. His grandson played the violin, trained voices from the New York Conservatory and from Boston. They performed, and then Douglass spoke. And so it was a success because it wasn't a watermelon festival, even though some people wrote it up like that. Now here's something odd. I was at a demonstration marching back in the 60s that Gregory led it, and I came back from the demonstration, and I went by the Buckingham Fountain to get my car, and there was a black woman. She had half a watermelon that had been busted open, and she was eating it with her fingers. And I'm thinking somebody found her somewhere, busted the watermelon open, and put it out of there to embarrass black people. I mean, where do you have? And that's what they worried about in 1893. This is back in 1962, 63.
Nothing has changed.
But it was not a watermelon festival. It was not cakewalking. It was very dignified, which I say would have offended working class blacks who liked their popular music. They had popular music. They had, this is interesting. Here's some groups here of blacks, you know, with violins and stuff. Blacks were playing with violins back in the 1890s. But I think probably a lot of black folks liking that also, like the popular music of the day. So we were not excluded from the World's Fair. You can't exclude us. Have we been to outer space? We were there a couple of thousand years ago. Nothing new. Who was that laughing? Get her name up here. Lady, get that lady name. I heard a man say that on 63rd Street, so I had no reason to know. This, since they have discovered batteries from 2,000 years ago, and still can't figure out how to put the pyramids up. I don't know what people have done in the past, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. I don't know if Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt, or if she under the effect of a nuclear blast.
Or controlled nuclear blast
On her, yeah. I don't know, because people seem to be reinventing things. I know somebody said the Africans sailed from Mali in that short distance from the west coast of Africa with the winds right over to Brazil before Columbus did it.
I heard that too.
Yeah, it made sense. It made sense. You can do it. You can do it in weeks.
Now that one was replicated.
Yeah,
they replicated that.
Thor Heyerdahl did it. Yeah, in a reed boat. You can do it. And the people in Mali would sail up and down the Niger River. They traded up and down the Niger River.
But there's a fellow, let me see if I can get the name. He was coming west and met Africans coming east. They were coming back east. And he, let me get the name, will come to me, but he documented, he said they must have been lost because the Africans circled around him and sailed around him and then they kept going. And I thought, well, let's change the perspective. The Africans had to be like, who's this idiot out here waiting on the wind?
Right.
You know, so they kind of like looked around and they said, well, you know, them out there just kept on doing it.
And you know, we can lead us, but scientifically, you do study the winds if you sail, and you find that the winds near the equator, you know, the problem with the Europeans, they couldn't turn the west coast of Africa, the Cape, they couldn't get around the Cape.
Right.
And then Columbus learned his sailing by mastering the winds.
Yes.
Sailing for the Portuguese government.
Yes.
And then later he was going to sail across the Atlantic. But if you master the winds, as the Africans would have living where they did, you can get over to Brazil.
Well, he had 4 of us
less
on
than-
the boat with him, so.
What's that again?
He had 4 of us on the boat with him, so.
You talking about Columbus?
Yeah.
Yeah, one being what's the guy name?
Estimado.
Pietro El Negro or somebody.
It wasn't his genius.
So, anyway, let's see now, were the black people excluded? No. Would you believe that an 8-day conference was held on whether or not to immigrate to Africa? Yeah, it took place. They talked about whether we should go back to Africa.
That was a bunch of contemporary stuff.
That's right. And then the voices saying stay won the day, led by Ida Wells' husband, to be Ferdinand Barnett, the man that published the paper right next to your hand. Hold that up, will you? The Conservator. He started that in 1878. At the World's Fair, he won the day arguing that we should stay here. And we've had trouble ever since.
When you finish the lecture, would you do me the favor of fine-tuning the difference between desegregation and integration?
Okay. Was there a special point of congregation on the fairgrounds for blacks? I named it.
Yes.
What place was that? Haitian Pavilion, yeah. And whites went by that too because they wanted to shake the hand of Frederick Douglass. And they got a chance to buy Paul Laurence Dunbar's Oak and Ivy and meet this woman who was the hero, anti-slavery hero, who toured England, Ida B. Wells. And drink delicious Haitian coffee, because the Haitians were pushing their coffee as the best in the world.
I mentioned their rum as well.
Yeah, I've had Haitian rum. It's powerful. Why would one woman be so bold as to lecture extensively on the topic, the intellectual progress of the colored women of the United States since the emancipation?
First wave feminism. First wave feminism.
I'm sorry.
First wave feminism. I mean, you thinking about, I just
right.
That Fannie Barry Williams book, and that's really what they were doing in the 1890s. You know?
Mention her name again, please.
Fannie Barry Williams.
Fannie Barry Williams?
She's the one that spoke. 5,000 word lecture to hundreds of women from all around the world. And other black women spoke at the World's Fair, mainly from the South and the Eastern Seaboard. Were blacks excluded from the World's Fair?
No.
Can't keep go-getters out. Can't keep good folk down.
Beverly, the place on 111, I forget what day in March they're having Haitian music from,
Well, I tell you, this Saturday, the Haitians are meeting again. I was with them last couple of years. They're meeting. You're going to that? It's going to be at the McCormick Place again. It was there last year. But every year the Haitian Heritage, they meet. I went again last year, and they have a good old time. And it doesn't hurt to know a little French, but they're very friendly. And they got me up there dancing. You know, their music never stops. My feet really hurt me for several days after. Not that I could dance, but they said, oh, you can dance. And they just were dancing and dancing. And my legs and feet were hurting for several days because it's like a half an hour, one piece. Yeah.
What is this event again?
The Haitians have an annual event here.
It's a celebration of Haitian culture? Or?
Yeah. And they band with us here because of Busabo. Yeah, we are, you might even see some Native Americans there. They invite you.
This is next Saturday.
At this and say, where's the event? Yeah, I think it's going to be at McCormick Place again. And they also raised a lot of money for Haiti before and after the hurricane.
Well, I've never heard of this. That's interesting. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, email me.
I do speak French.
Email me, yeah. Tickets are reasonable. Look, so that winds up blacks in the 19th century. We were here from the beginning. We ended this century going to war, fighting down in Cuba. Men from Illinois ran 2 towns down in Cuba in that short war, the Spanish-Americans-Cuban War. Those are men from the Armory right down here at 35th Street, where Bronzeville Military Academy is. They were down there, and later they were to fight Poncho France during World War I. So we have a military tradition. You mentioned it. Going back in the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War, having a militia unit, forcing through political pressure the governor to say, okay, you can have a full regiment, the 8th Illinois Regiment.
But we raised half the money ourselves.
We raised the money ourselves. That armory was opened in 1915. How many have been inside the armory? The events there, my father, when he was alive, would talk about all the big events in there, from boxing to grand dancing.
Joe Louis card, the thing that Joe Louis, the victory card.
Joe Louis, yeah.
National Negro Congress.
National Negro Congress.
Marcus Garvey was there.
Marcus Garvey was there.
This is the one in Washington Park?
No, right down here, on 35th Street in
Giles.
Giles. It's not a military, Brownsville military
It's a
camp.
school over here.
Yeah, and by the way, that was the first built from the ground up for a black unit with all black officers. All the officers were always
Dennison or
black.
Scott that got elected. But it was Colonel Dennison or Scott that got elected to the Congress, state legislature.
I know that.
It might have been Dennison. Well, get money. They couldn't get funding for a building.
Yeah.
So they elected one of their officers, their commanding officer, to the State House down in Springfield, and he muscled through money for the building.
Marshall.
Okay, Charles, yeah, Marshall, okay.
Just to say, if you remember Dr. Gloria Jackson Bacon, who used to be
Oh, yeah.
trustee of the University of Illinois,
Right.
her husband was the first general, brigadier general, which is the first general
Oh, yeah.
in rank. So he was the first general to lead that school when it was open.
Nice.
Right.
He passed away, and she moved back to her home in
Where?
New Orleans.
Okay.
My grandfather was one of the earliest soldiers in that.
In the 8th?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He didn't get a chance to fight overseas. He always wanted to fight, but he was too young for the First World War, and he was too old for the Second, so he didn't fight.
Got a question. A black person, we about finished, but before you know it, say, man, ain't nothing named after black folks here. So you name the buildings, right? Then they say in the school, with no public art. What do you think about public art?
Richard
Down on
Hunt.
35th and the black soldier, right? 35th.
The monument.
Yeah, that was a big, that's political clout. Nobody wanted to build that honoring black soldiers, but it's there. Black folks is something else. It's there. And on the other end of King Drive, what is it?
Statue.
Monument to the Great Migration.
That's right.
The King Drive Walk of Fame is Chicago's largest exhibition of outdoor public art. Chicago is very proud of outdoor art, from Picasso to the Bean to whatever. But this year, started in December, there's now a whole inventory going on World War I monuments.
Okay.
And I was someplace looking at this. So it's an online inventory, it's an act of Congress, and now there's also going to be some funding in terms of restoring these monuments. So Victory, not only is it looked at as Victory Monument for us at 35th Street, but Victory Monument Plaza. And really, to your point, that 8th Regiment Armory should be considered part of that as well.
Remember you had a tour of military,
Yeah.
and that included the armory,
Right.
where the Catholics are, down on the corner of 35th, back across from you. Well, that's now the Archdiocese, but that's the old Soldiers Rest, Soldiers Home, yeah, Soldiers
I should
Home.
do that tour again.
Yeah.
Yeah, the military.
And Sherry's working on something now that'll give us a Patriots Pavilion right at 35th Street, where we're getting this fabulous new suspension bridge.
Oh, when you cross over to, yeah, that's gonna be nice. Yeah, that's good. By the way, Sherry, you wanna put, we ending, can you we wanna put a plug in for visiting 35th?
I'm Sherry Williams. I'm founder and director of Bronzeville Historical Society. Our office is located at the Stephen A. Douglas tomb site. Senator Douglas's tomb has been here in Chicago since 1861. There's a cottage building on the site where Bronzeville Historical Society has its offices. And piggybacking off of what Paula said, there is an effort that is growing tremendously to support the installation of a Patriots Pavilion honoring African American soldiers and patriots, not necessarily people who served in the military, but say, for instance, my grandmother came here in 1942, worked for a company called Echo Products as a result of World War II efforts for making things for World War II servicemen. So she made spatulas and canteens and other items. So I consider her a patriot as well, that she worked in the war efforts during World War II. So Patriots Pavilion in the sense that not just those who supported our nation and our country as being military personnel in your own families that should be celebrated. So Patriots Pavilion is an effort to put an installation starting from 18th Street on the north as far south as 47th Street along the lakefront existing pathways. We've proposed that there's installations of art, memorabilia, text, photos that will be celebrating and honoring our enormous past in military service to this nation.
Modern day folks.
Modern day works as well. Oh, wonderful. And so we've leaned on Illinois Institute of Technology to do the footwork, to put together the language that would definitely commemorate how service is looked at, how freedom is looked at. It's meant to be a reflective space, not a memorial, nothing sad is the intent. And so I want to applaud our friend here who is sitting here very quietly.
Please raise your hand.
Leroy Kennedy has solicited several classes to compile the data because it's a tremendous amount of work that it takes to put the narratives together, what that might look like. And we've got fingers crossed that the combined efforts that have been working between all of the institutions that are represented here, whether it's Cat Douglas Restoration with Bernard Turner,
Now raise your hand.
all of us,
Active with Camp Davis.
Paula Robinson working
Douglas.
with several layers as well, so it's a combined effort. And we do hope that you guys will reach out to Professor Reed, and he can pass to you what that's looking like. So a lot of the work has been done already to make certain that it happened. And we trust it'll happen, that it's done.
An announcement also.
Yeah, well, we want to end with Paula Robinson here, who is going to have a meeting starting now. But you want to introduce yourself? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Paula Robinson of the Black Metropolis National Heritage Area Commission. And the Heritage Area Commission has been functioning since 2004 with the steering committee. Professor Reed is our historian for that commission. Other members that have been working to help us get a feasibility are here also. Leroy Kennedy, Bernard Turner, Yvette Legrand, and myself have been active in just what is required with this application. So just as you heard about Pullman getting the designation as a national monument, that includes really the Pullman community. It's not just the clock tower, so it's the designation of what is South and North Pullman. So another National Park Service designation is a National Heritage Area. So a while back when we did our first study, we met the criteria to call ourselves a National Heritage Area, and so we do. But we want the formal congressional designation, which would allow us to attract up to $1 million a year for our efforts over a 10 to 15 year period. So Congressman Rush has been our long-term time champion on this. He just reintroduced new legislation in this current Congress. I think it's H.R. 904. And so you can see that we have received formal comments on the feasibility study that we worked on with CMAP. CMAP is the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. So we had a small group of historians and social historians as well putting together this feasibility study. So we got comments back, and so what we're going to do, we've been asked to revise our statement of significance. And so what they want to do is to have this statement revised coming from the Black Chicago History Forum, signing off on this revision. And so we're going to be interviewing Dr. Reed for the hour that we have before we close with this list of questions. And basically the questions are, why Chicago? You know, why our significant American story, which is what we met the criteria for, is the story of the Great Migration. But obviously there are many places that share the story of the Great Migration, from New York to Cleveland, wherever. There are some reasons that we think that Chicago would communicate this national story best. But apparently we have been too shy on the comments and what we're saying. They want to understand with certainty why it should be Chicago. So for example, there are many places that celebrate the Civil War history. You know, Virginia, South, you know, Bernard and I went to see the National Heritage Area in South Carolina. A lot of this is political in terms of who gets it done first, who documents it, who really understands what's the value of saying we are showcasing that history for America. In this case, for the Civil War, Tennessee actually has the story for the Civil War. They're the Civil War National Heritage Area. But as you say, it could have been many places. So we know that it's taken us a long time to get it done. We have the support of the National Park Service because, as what Sip was talking about, they feel that we've worked for 20 years doing it the right way in terms of trying to restore, you know, as much of what already made up the Black Metropolis Historic District. Now the Heritage Area it actually follows the geographic map known as the Black Belt, and it did start at 12th Street. We conceded to 18th Street as part of the Restoring Bronzeville campaign, primarily because politically they were trying to create this new community called Central Station. But for us, those boundaries are from 18th Street to 71st Street, pretty much from the Dan Ryan to the lake. So at 47th, it actually cuts around and goes down Cottage. So when we talk about the Black Metropolis National Heritage Area, right now, if we're successful in trying to leverage something during this, this mayoral election, our key message is that the victory is the Obama Library going in the Black Metropolis National Heritage Area. You know, this is not just U of C sort of crossing Cottage Grove and saying, hey, we're going to do something nice for Bronzeville. The community has been working for 20 years to restore Bronzeville and working on this designation for the National Heritage Area. And just as a side note, we were involved with another group that put together a formal proposal for the Obama Library. We really felt strongly that the highest and best use was the Michael Reese site. Our intent was to give Obama his own park, not just Washington Park, Jackson Park, Lincoln Park. We felt that the president coming from here in the south side of Chicago, that this spot where he had been a part of the dream team trying to get the Olympic Village, which is still this hole that's left there next to McCormick Place, was ideal. We also thought that because of some of the things that took place next to the McCormick Place campus, like he and Emmanuel doing NATO summit there, and then him announcing his last victory in candidacy, has always been on the Lake Shore, and that last time it was at McCormick Place. So we put together a proposal that he really focused on him being a digital president, multiple universities being at that site, being able to really focus on this lakefront, and we understand all of the things that he's done. So we were not successful in that, but I think that we really learned a lot in that process. We did get a lot of accolades for it, and so we're still in the game. I think that we've got to be smart in getting this proposal. The National Park Service is saying they would like to see the rewrite of this as quickly as possible, and that we would have the Chicago Black History Forum signing off on those revisions. So that's what we're going to do in this last half hour, and have the people from the team, interview Dr. Black. And their thing is, you all have now been in more competition with other cities, so you should be able to now communicate more strongly why Chicago, in terms of the Great Migration story. Great.
Right.
So we're ready when you are.
Yeah, this is.
So you said Dr. Black, which means Dr. Reed?
I said Dr. Black. I'm sorry. He's off the line.
Just real quick, my name is Lionel Kimball. Some of you know me, Labor Secretary of Black Chicago History Forum. But I'm also Associate Professor of History at Chicago State University. But outside of that, I'm a member of an organization called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Some of you may have heard about it before. It was started by Carter G. Woodson in 1915, September 9th, 1915 at the Wabash Avenue YMCA. That being said, this is our centennial celebration this year. Right? There aren't many Black-led organizations, learned societies like us. We're not a professional organization, we're a learned society. because many of our members, the overwhelming number of our members are lay people. We're celebrating the legacy of Carter G. Woodson this year. It's a national celebration in Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and here in Chicago. As some of you may know, 1915 was the Jubilee celebration of the emancipation in the Civil War, emancipation of African Americans. And it was a convention sponsored at the Coliseum Auditorium by the state of Illinois. Woodson was in Chicago, studying at the University of Chicago, and he goes there to the Jubilee celebration. He sees all of these fantastic exhibits there, and he comes back to the Wabash Y and he meets with people like George Cleveland Hall, A.L. Jackson, and the like, and they form the Association for Negro Life and History. I say all that is that Christoper and I are part of the Centennial Celebration. We're co-chairs for the Chicago Centennial Celebration, and we're promoting and fundraising for a series of events that will take place during September 9th at the Wabash Y, at the George Cleveland Hall Library, at Chicago State, and culminating at the Woodson Library on 95th Street. And the culminating event will be a free event at the DeSable Museum of African American History, which discusses the life and legacy of Carter G. Woodson. Right now, we have our national president coming in. He's a brother from Chicago, graduate of Hales Franciscan High School, teaches at Howard University. We have
What's his name?
Daryl Scott. Yeah, Daryl. So he's coming back, and we're planning a plaque. Wabash Y on September 9th, the actual founding day, was followed by photos at the Hall Library. Right now, we're working on the big event. We have a Woodson biographer, a young brother from Michigan State University, coming down to do a talk, and we're trying to get some information from either Lonnie Bunch, who many of you may know is the brother who's leading up the creation of the National African American History Museum in the Mall. He used to be at the Chicago History Museum, kind of owes me a favor, so we're trying to get him back here. But
Me one too.
yeah, so June Patton is kind of twisting his arm. She's one of the members of the forum. So there will be information via the well, and of course, my agendas are all of this are free. So keep an eye out. If you want to donate some money, right? Talk to Christoper, and there's a GoFundMe site that is available. And we're trying to raise. We're turning the corner. We got about $5,000 to raise till we can get our event going. So that's about it.
I sit on the local school council in Woodson School.
Yeah.
So I can't speak for the principal, but I can certainly speak for the council. We'd like to be in some way a part of this celebration, to be included.
You bet. I live on home, and that's it's one of those things.
I live around the corner from.
Yeah, and I lost your phone number, so I'm glad.
We'll do that.
Yeah, I lost your phone. I looked through my text messages, and I found it.
I'll mark the list that you'll see.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Are you going to bring that to sort of a higher academic level? Because Carter G. Woodson is a fan of all the Black national side,
yeah.
And I'd like for you to contrast between Du Bois and Woodson, and the fact that Du Bois tried to do that whole encyclopedia piece,
right?
But he went through the academic portion, and Woodson did it, and every Black piece. Right. Like do that contrast. I was trying to tell them at Harvard they need to do a society for Woodson when I was up there. So we need to do that. But everybody pushed Du Bois' piece, which is nice. But the contribution of what Woodson's done with the Negro, Johnson publishes Negro Life and that whole genre. Yeah. And we need to kind of push that story out.
But here's the thing about, and this is one of the things that attracted me to. Look, this is the only organization I belong to. All the other historical associations, I come and go with it. I'm a life member of ASALA, right? And part of history is that when Woodson started this organization, there were 2 Black PhDs in the country, him and Du Bois, right? So Woodson, right? So if you think about it, the membership, the thing that that keeps the organization going, kept the organization going for 100 years, were not academics, right? We had our last convention was in Memphis, Tennessee. We had about 1,100 people there. I think it's safe to say that maybe 2/3 of those people weren't affiliated with the university. right? So that's I think a very important part of the story, a very important part of what Woodson was trying to do, to bring history, to chronicle the history of black folk for black folk.
It's after 4 o'clock, we better let Paula do her thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Want to come up on here? Yeah, thanks for coming out.
Can we stay to hear the questions, or is it private?
Yeah, no, it's not private, is it?
No, we got Beck and Bernard doing the questions.
Yeah.
Oh, right. I would tell us that. Yeah, that's good. Bernard, the first one to retire.
Thank you for your participation. Be sure to watch your email for the next Chicago Black History Forum.